It was the summer of 2007 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I was 28 years old, eager to get away from the city noise and the constant buzz of work emails and phone calls. I had done camping before, but never completely alone in such a remote area. My goal was simple: pack light, find a good spot by the river, and spend 4 days off the grid, reading, hiking, and just breathing fresh air. I left my apartment in Asheville early one Friday morning, driving a beaten-up old Jeep Cherokee that had been with me through a few cross-country trips. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth even before I reached the mountains, the kind of smell that makes you feel alive in a way the city never can. The winding roads were narrow and sometimes so steep I had to be careful not to slip off the edges. But the sun was bright and the weather forecast was clear. I told myself it would be a perfect getaway. I carried a simple backpack, a small tent, sleeping bag, basic cooking supplies, water filter, a first aid kit, some granola bars, a few cans of beans, a small axe, and a book I had been meaning to read for months. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. My phone had no signal once I turned off the main road, which was exactly what I wanted. By noon, I had driven to a small gravel pull-off next to a trailhead. The trail was unmarked on the map, which was part of the appeal. Fewer people would come here. I strapped on my pack and started walking, the gravel crunching under my hiking boots. The trail wound through dense forest, mostly pine and oak, with thick underbrush that brushed against my legs. I could hear birds singing overhead, an occasional rustle of squirrels or deer moving nearby. The air was cool but humid, carrying the faint, fresh scent of moss and wildflowers. After about 2 hours of steady uphill hiking, I found a small clearing near the edge of a creek. The water was clear and cold, bubbling over smooth stones. The sunlight filtered through the tall trees in long slanted beams, making the leaves look almost golden. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the water, careful to stay a little above the creek bank to avoid any flooding if it rained. The spot was quiet except for the sound of water and the forest. The first night passed uneventfully. I cooked some beans on my small camping stove, ate slowly while watching the stars come out, bright and countless. I lay in my tent listening to the forest's night sounds. Crickets, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the creek, feeling peaceful and content. The second day, I planned a longer hike to explore more of the area. I left early, following the creek upstream, stepping carefully over slick rocks and fallen logs. The forest grew thicker here, the canopy so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. I noticed fresh animal tracks near the water's edge, maybe a bear or a large deer. It made me feel cautious but not scared. This was nature, after all. I found an old dirt path leading away from the creek and decided to follow it. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick ferns and patches of wild blueberries. I stopped often to rest, drinking water and taking photos with my small camera. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a ruined stone foundation. It looked like the remains of an old cabin or hunting lodge. The stones were covered in moss, some scattered haphazardly. I wondered who had lived here and why it was abandoned. Curiosity pushed me to explore the area more carefully. Among the stones, I found rusted nails, fragments of old glass, and bits of charred wood, evidence that a fire had once swept through here. I imagined the family or hunter who might have lived and worked here decades ago, left behind by time and the wilderness. I stayed until the sun was low, then made my way back down to my camp. The forest was darker now, the shadows long and thick. When I reached my tent, the air had cooled quickly, and a light mist was beginning to settle over the creek. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the tent's poles and shaking the branches overhead. I lay awake listening to the rain pattering softly on the nylon roof. The creek had swelled slightly, rushing louder than before. I was glad I had pitched my tent on higher ground. The third day started cold and damp. The rain had stopped, but everything was soaked, and the ground was muddy. I decided to stay close to camp, using the day to rest and gather firewood. I was careful to collect only dry branches from under thick evergreens, as damp wood was useless for a fire. While gathering wood, I noticed something unusual: a set of footprints in the mud, larger than mine, heading downstream along the creek. They looked fresh. My heart sped up for a moment, but I told myself it was probably another hiker or a hunter who had passed by earlier. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. Being alone in the wilderness meant dealing with the unknown. Sometimes wildlife, sometimes other people. But I was careful, experienced enough to avoid trouble. As dusk fell on the third day, I built a campfire near the creek, using dry wood I had stored. The fire crackled and sent sparks upward, the warm glow pushing back the growing darkness. I ate cold beans from the can and sipped water filtered from the creek. The forest around me was silent except for the occasional splash of fish jumping in the water. I decided to turn in early, feeling tired from the long day. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped my tent shut, and listened to the night sounds. The creek's rushing water was louder now, and the wind was picking up again. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a loud snapping sound nearby. It was a sharp crack, like a heavy branch breaking. My heart raced. I sat up quietly and listened. The wind had stopped, and everything else was silent except for the soft rustling of leaves. Suddenly, I heard the sound again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on wet earth, coming closer. I froze, clutching my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating thick trees and heavy underbrush. I waited, eyes straining. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of light. For what felt like minutes, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, the sound of something dragging along the ground. It was hard to tell what it was. Maybe a fallen branch or a large animal. My mind raced through possibilities. It wasn't a bear or a deer. Those make noise differently, and I had heard the footprints earlier. This must be a person. I felt a cold wave of fear. Not the kind from supernatural stories or movies, but real, primal fear. Someone was nearby, out there in the forest, and I had no way to call for help. My phone was dead from lack of signal, and my backpack held only basic survival gear. I gripped my small hunting knife, which I kept in a sheath on my belt, and silently unzipped my tent to peek outside. The fire had burned low but was still glowing embers. The forest was dark, the shadows long and twisting in the firelight. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees just at the edge of the firelight. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat and a hood pulled low. His face was shadowed and unreadable. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't speak or move closer, just stood watching. Fear tightened my chest. I didn't want a confrontation, but I wasn't going to run blindly into the woods either. I slowly reached for my backpack, pulling out my flare gun, something I'd packed just in case. The figure took a step forward. I raised the flare gun and fired a bright red flare high into the sky. The forest lit up in a surreal glow, startling birds into flight and scattering small animals. The man shouted something I couldn't hear clearly and turned, disappearing quickly into the woods. My heart pounded for minutes after. I stayed awake, clutching the flare gun, listening for any other signs of movement, but the forest was silent again except for the creek. The next morning, I packed quickly, deciding not to wait for my planned fourth day. I took a different route back to the main trailhead, moving cautiously but steadily. When I reached the gravel parking lot, I found two park rangers waiting. They had been alerted by the flare gun, which had been spotted from a nearby ridge. They asked a few questions, took my statement about the stranger. Apparently, there had been reports of an escaped prisoner in the area, a man who had fled a nearby work camp weeks before. They hadn't been able to find him yet. I felt a mix of relief and shock. I hadn't imagined the footsteps, the dragging noise, or the figure by my tent. It was all real. The rangers offered to drive me back to Asheville, which I gratefully accepted. Looking back, that trip taught me how unpredictable and fragile safety can be in the wilderness. No stories, no myths, just real danger from people, from nature, and from being alone when you least expect it. I still love camping, but now I'm extra careful. I always tell someone where I'm going, carry more than one way to call for help, and trust my instincts. That night in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I learned that fear is not just about ghosts or monsters. It's about survival, knowing when to stand your ground, when to act fast, and when to get the hell out. And sometimes, I took a solo camping trip in October 2017, right after I turned 31. I had been working as a freelance graphic designer for most of that year, and after a long streak of stressful client projects, I needed to unplug. I didn't want to deal with people, phones, or anything that made noise. I just wanted to get lost for a few days and clear my head. I picked a remote part of western Montana, near the Bitterroot National Forest, far enough away from towns and traffic. I'd been to that general area a couple times when I was younger, but this particular spot was new to me. It wasn't in a developed campground, just open land off an old Forest Service road that looked good on satellite maps. No trails, no fire rings, no signs, just nature. I drove up in my old Toyota 4Runner with a cooler, gear, and 3 days of food. The road turned into a rocky, narrow path after a while, overgrown and barely wide enough for my SUV. I passed through dense pine forest, climbed a couple switchbacks, then found a small pull-off spot on a ridge. From there I hiked about 40 minutes downhill with my backpack and set up camp in a flat spot near a dry creek bed. The trees were thinner down there, and the underbrush wasn't too thick. I could see enough sky to feel open, but I was still surrounded by forest. No sign of people. No wrappers, no fire pits, no logs shaped into seats, nothing. That's what I wanted. I had a basic one-man tent, a cold-rated sleeping bag, and a folding chair. I didn't bring a gun, but I had a good knife, a bear spray canister, and a small hatchet. I'm not one of those survivalist guys or anything. I just like being in the woods, and I try to be careful. I strung up my food on a high branch maybe 30 yards away from camp and gathered some dry wood for a small fire. That first night was calm. I read a bit by flashlight, ate some freeze-dried stew, drank a bottle of water, and went to sleep early. The air was cold but not freezing. I didn't hear anything unusual, just wind in the trees and a few distant owl calls. The next morning I woke up early, sore but rested. I made some instant coffee over a little propane stove and ate a granola bar. After sitting and listening to the quiet for a while, I decided to explore. I took a compass and a small day pack with snacks, water, and a first aid kit. I hiked north, climbing a slope and following the dry creek uphill. The forest was thicker up that way, with fallen trees and slippery rocks. I didn't see much wildlife, just a few birds and some tracks that might have been elk or deer. After a couple hours, I stopped and ate lunch on a big boulder in a sunny clearing. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. Off to the side of the clearing, near the edge of a hill, was a tree stump that looked off. It wasn't just cut. It had been stripped of bark and flattened smooth on top, like it had been sanded or burned. Around it were a few pieces of metal and what looked like an old tin can, mostly rusted through. I figured maybe someone camped there years ago, but the stump still didn't sit right with me. It looked deliberate, almost like a workbench or seat. I moved on and kept walking for another hour before heading back toward camp. That night, I didn't feel quite as relaxed. I wasn't scared exactly, just unsettled. I stayed up later listening. I didn't hear anything alarming, just wind again, and what I assumed were branches falling in the woods. Normal forest sounds. I still had cell signal if I climbed up toward the ridge, so I checked the weather, no storms coming, cold but dry. I decided I'd hike a different direction the next day and just ignore whatever weird vibe I'd gotten earlier. I figured I was just overthinking things. On the second full day, I headed west. I followed some old animal trails and found a thicket of aspens in a shallow valley. It was peaceful and beautiful. I took some photos with my phone and sat there for a while, leaning against my pack. I noticed there were no animal sounds though. No squirrels, no birds, nothing moving in the brush. That silence didn't feel normal. After an hour or so, I hiked back to camp. That night was different. I was sitting near the fire, bundled in my jacket and watching the flames when I heard something. Not a twig snap or an animal call, but a rustling sound. Heavy, slow, deliberate, like something large brushing through the underbrush. It came from the direction of the food bag I had strung up. I grabbed the flashlight and quietly walked toward it. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been. I wasn't afraid of a raccoon or even a bear. I just had this tight feeling in my gut like something was wrong. When I reached the tree where my food was hanging, the bag was still there. But the brush around the area had been disturbed. Couldn't tell by what. I shined the flashlight around and saw what looked like a footprint in the soft dirt. Not a clear one, just the shape of a sole like a boot. I hadn't been over there since I strung the bag up, and I didn't remember stepping there. The tread didn't match my boots either. I stood still for a while, scanning the trees, but I didn't see or hear anything else. I backed away slowly and returned to the fire. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake in the tent, ears straining. Once or twice I thought I heard breathing slow and steady, but it could have been my imagination or wind gusting in a certain way. I had the hatchet next to me in the tent. I didn't light another fire that night. I just waited for morning. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't eat, just got everything into my pack and started climbing back toward the SUV. The hike uphill was rough with all my gear, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I still felt watched. I reached the SUV, threw my pack in the back, and sat for a minute to catch my breath. That's when I saw the scratch marks on the passenger door. Not deep, but long, 3 thin, curved lines, as if made by metal or claws. But they were too precise to be random. I hadn't noticed them when I parked. I stood up and looked around. Nothing moved, just trees and wind. I drove back down the path slowly, heart still racing. I kept the windows up and the doors locked. After a few minutes of bumping along the road, I passed a small open area on the right side I hadn't noticed on the way up. It looked like someone had cleared a spot recently. There were tire marks, a few stacked stones, and what looked like a torn blue tarp hanging from a branch. I didn't stop. When I got to a paved road, I finally let out a breath. I drove into a small town about 40 miles away and parked at a gas station. I got out to use the bathroom and noticed something in the dust on the back window. Someone had dragged their finger through the dirt and written one word, "Why?" I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't noticed it earlier. I don't know when it was written. I wiped it off, filled up with gas, and drove straight home without stopping again. I didn't call the sheriff or report anything. I couldn't explain what had happened without sounding paranoid or crazy. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just a hunter messing with me. Maybe someone had set up a remote camp nearby and didn't like that I was close. Or maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still go out into the woods, but I always go with someone now. And I always keep a better eye on my surroundings. That trip stuck with me, not because something dramatic happened, but because of how close it felt. Whatever was out there didn't make itself fully known. It didn't attack. It didn't scream or leave a clear message. It just watched, came close, left signs. That quiet presence, that subtle warning, it was enough. I still think about the footprint, the scratches, the word on the window, and I think that maybe that was their way of saying, "You don't belong here," and I listened. It was late August of 2017 when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip in the forests outside of Redcliffe, Alberta. I was 33 then, single, working remote most of the time, and needed a break from the same walls I stared at every day. The air was just starting to cool in the mornings, but the days were still hot enough to sweat if you walked more than a few minutes in the sun. I packed my gear in the back of my old gray Tacoma and left early in the morning to avoid the weekend rush. I wanted to be alone. Really alone. The kind of alone you can only get when your phone doesn't work and the closest person is maybe 5 miles away. I had scoped out an old Cutline trail months before while mountain biking, way off the beaten path, and I remembered thinking that it would make a great spot to camp if I ever needed real solitude. The trail was mostly overgrown now and barely visible from the gravel forestry road. You'd miss it if you blinked. I drove out past the marked campsites and fire pits people usually used, then cut down that faint trail, slowly navigating around fallen logs and ruts until I reached a flat spot beside a small, nameless creek. The trees around me were tall and tight, mostly spruce with some thick poplars and birch mixed in. Felt like I was inside a green wall. The sound of the water trickling by added a sense of calm that I didn't realize I had needed so badly. I spent the first few hours just getting my camp set up. I pitched my tent just above the creek on a patch of mossy ground and laid out a small cooking area near the fire ring I built with some old stones. I cut some kindling and stacked firewood. I didn't bring anything fancy, just my small propane stove, a cooler full of eggs, bacon, sandwich meat, and a 6-pack of beer. I brought 2 books, my fishing rod, a journal, and a folding chair. That was it. That first night was peaceful. The sky was clear, and the stars looked closer than I ever remembered. I sat by the fire with my boots off, warm socks on, and sipped a beer while listening to the wind push through the treetops. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. The second day started off quiet too. I walked along the creek for a couple of hours, did some fishing, and caught 2 small trout that I fried in butter and ate with toast. Around mid-afternoon, I hiked up a small ridge behind my camp to get a better view of the area. From the top, I could see how thick the woods really were. No clearings, no trails, nothing but green in every direction. I felt good up there, tired but content. When I got back down, I cleaned up, made a small fire, and cooked some sausages. I planned to stay 4 nights total. It wasn't until that 3rd day that I started noticing something that didn't sit right. I woke up a little earlier than usual. The sun hadn't come over the ridge yet, and it was cold enough that I could see my breath. I crawled out of the tent to start boiling water for coffee, and when I looked over toward the fire pit, I saw that the folding chair I always left sitting by the stones was now tipped over. Not a big deal, wind maybe, but it hadn't been breezy that night. Still, I picked it up and didn't think much of it. But then I noticed a small drag mark in the dirt, just beside the fire pit, like something had scraped or been pulled slightly across the ground. At first, I figured it was from my boots or maybe something I dropped the night before, but when I looked closer, it didn't match anything I remembered doing. It curved off about a foot or 2 before stopping near a patch of flattened grass. Again, nothing major, just strange. Later that day, I took a longer hike further upstream, probably about a mile, and found a wider pool in the creek with some bigger fish swimming lazily in the deeper water. I stood there for a while watching them, not even casting, just staring into the ripples. That calm didn't last though. When I got back to camp around dusk, I immediately saw that something was off again. One of the big rocks I used to form the fire ring had been moved out of place, sitting a few feet away from the circle. Not kicked, moved cleanly and deliberately. It was heavy, probably 15 or 20 pounds, and I had to use 2 hands to place it there originally. The firewood stack also looked different, like someone had taken a couple logs from it and set them off to the side. Not scattered, not broken, just placed. I remember standing there for a long minute just staring at the rock, feeling my heartbeat start to rise in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. There was no sign of animals, no claw marks, no torn packaging, no broken cooler or scattered food. It felt too exact for an animal, too organized. I slept with my hatchet beside my sleeping bag that night. I didn't light a fire. I just crawled in and zipped up and laid there listening to the wind. I barely slept. Every sound felt like it was coming too close. A couple times I thought I heard twigs snap near the creek, but I couldn't be sure. I told myself it was probably deer. In the morning, I found a boot print. Not mine. It was down near the edge of the creek, where the mud was soft and thin. Just one print, but clear enough that I could see the tread pattern. It didn't match mine. It was from a hiking boot, but the pattern was different, smaller triangles worn on the inside edges. The print pointed toward the water, like whoever made it was either leaving or just standing there looking down into it. I stood over it for a long time trying to make sense of it. I walked a wide circle around the area to see if there were more, but I didn't find anything else. That 4th day, I couldn't relax. I kept stopping whatever I was doing and looking around. I didn't hike. I didn't fish. I didn't read. I just kind of sat in the chair with my hatchet on my lap and kept looking into the woods, trying to spot something out of place. Every so often, I'd hear something snap or shift, but it was always too quick to track. Around 4 p.m., I made the call to pack up a day early. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there watching me. I kept thinking about that boot print and the way the rock was moved and how nothing was ever damaged, just touched, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there without actually showing themselves. I threw everything back into the truck quickly. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, chair, cooler. I didn't pack it neatly. I just shoved it all in, slammed the tailgate, and climbed into the driver's seat. The worst part came when I started to back down the overgrown trail and had to go slow. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind me. No one did, but the feeling didn't go away. When I finally got back to the main gravel road and saw tire tracks from other vehicles, I felt the tension start to ease a little. I drove another half hour before I pulled over, got out, and checked the back of the truck just to be sure everything was still there. It was, but something made me open the cooler. Inside, everything was the way I'd left it, except for the six-pack. One bottle was missing. That detail froze me, not because it was valuable, but because I knew I hadn't touched it since the second night. There were only 5 bottles left, evenly spaced, like they hadn't shifted during the drive. Whoever it was, they had taken one beer and closed the lid again, gently, like a signature. I didn't go back to that area again. I camped other places that year, more public, closer to trailheads with people around. I told myself maybe someone else was camping nearby and stumbled across my spot. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they didn't mean harm. But that didn't explain the rock, or the boots that didn't match mine, or how quiet they were, how careful. It's been years since that trip, and I still think about it when I'm out alone. Not because anything happened, but because of how close something felt without ever showing its face. I still go camping, but I carry a lot more than a hatchet now. And I don't camp in places where I can't see another human being within walking distance. That feeling of being watched, of being almost touched, sticks with you longer than you'd expect. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a week off work and go camping alone. I had been working nonstop in an auto body shop in Phoenix, and between the heat, the noise, and the fumes, I needed to reset. I was 31 back then, single, and hadn't really taken a proper vacation in 2 years. I didn't want to travel far or spend a lot of money. I just wanted to be in nature with no phones, no people, and no alarms. I picked a place about 6 hours north, in northern Utah, near the Ashley National Forest. It wasn't too touristy, and the farther you went from the highway, the more isolated it got. I found a section of forest near a small lake, tucked behind a few low hills, that seemed perfect. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing I spotted using satellite maps and some old backpacking forums. Most people didn't go that deep in, which is exactly why I chose it. I packed up everything on a Thursday morning: tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, a hand-cranked radio, a small solar charger, 2 knives, bear spray, and enough food and water for 7 days. I also brought a map of the area, a compass, and my old hiking boots that I hadn't used in a while. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just left a note on my fridge for my neighbor in case something happened. The drive was peaceful. Once I got off the highway, I followed a gravel road that ran along a shallow river. The scenery changed from dry scrub to tall evergreens and aspen trees. By the time I got to the trailhead, I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. I parked just off the road in a narrow clearing, shouldered my heavy pack, and started the 2-hour hike up toward the lake. It was harder than I remembered from my younger days. The air was thinner and cooler, and my legs ached from the weight of the pack. But it was worth it. The trail narrowed until it was just packed dirt and pine needles, and eventually I came to the lake. Small, clear, and still, with tall grass around the edges and a soft slope on the far side. The sun was still high, and the shadows from the trees danced across the water. I found a flat spot beneath a few tall trees, just out of sight from the lake, and set up camp. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles. I pitched the tent carefully, made a small fire pit with rocks, and gathered some fallen branches. That first evening, I just sat by the lake watching dragonflies skim the surface and listening to the birds. I made pasta over the camp stove, cleaned up, and crawled into my tent just after the sun dipped behind the ridge. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I hiked short trails during the day, rested by the water, read a little, and kept a small fire going in the evenings. I kept everything tidy, stored food properly, and made sure not to leave anything out that might attract animals. I saw a few deer, lots of squirrels, and what I think was a coyote once in the distance. I slept well, better than I had in months. The air was cool, quiet, and smelled like pine and earth. By the third night, I was more relaxed than I'd been in a long time. I had dinner by the lake and took a long walk along the ridge behind my camp. From up there, I could see for miles. Endless trees, low hills, and no signs of people or lights. That's when I noticed something odd. On a slope across the lake, opposite my camp, I saw a small shape. It was low to the ground, dark, and didn't move. At first, I thought it was a stump or maybe a bear, but it looked too square. I stared at it for a few minutes. It didn't move at all. I figured it must be part of the landscape, maybe a fallen log or a rock, and went back to camp. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. I didn't know why at first. It was cold, and the forest was silent, almost too silent. Normally, you hear insects, owls, or small animals at night, but it was dead quiet. I stayed still and listened. After a minute, I heard something soft, slow footsteps outside my tent. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. They moved around the tent in a wide circle, crunching pine needles softly underfoot. I held my breath and reached for my knife beside the sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped for a while, then moved off into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked around my tent. No footprints. The ground was too dry and soft. I didn't see any broken branches or disturbed soil. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe even my imagination. I made coffee and tried to shake it off. Later that day, I decided to check out the other side of the lake, where I'd seen the shape on the slope. I packed some snacks, grabbed my knife and compass, and followed the shoreline until I reached the far side. The ground was steeper and rougher over there, with tall grass and uneven dirt. It took some effort to climb up to the spot I'd seen from the ridge. When I got there, I found an old camp. Not a new one, an old one like someone had set it up months ago and left it to rot. There was a small square tarp, half buried under leaves, a broken plastic container, a rusted pot. Everything was weathered and scattered, like it had been picked through by animals. I found a torn backpack and, inside it, some food wrappers, a dead flashlight, and an empty notebook. No name, no ID. Nothing to tell who it belonged to. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The hairs on my arms were standing up. Something about it felt wrong, like someone had left in a hurry. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I had no service out there. Then I backed away and headed back to my camp. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook. I ate a cold granola bar and sat in the tent with the flap zipped tight. I listened. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, but metal. A soft, faint clinking sound, like two pieces of metal bumping into each other. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from the direction of the lake, and it lasted only a few seconds. Then silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the knife, my back against the tent wall. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just tore down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and headed down the trail. It was harder going back, not just because of the weight, but because I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound, every snapping branch, made my chest tighten. I was about halfway back to the car when I noticed something new. On the side of the trail, carved into the bark of a tree, was a mark. Not just a random scratch, this was intentional. It looked like a square with a line through it. I don't know what it meant, but it wasn't there when I came up. I know that for sure. I stared at it for a while, then forced myself to keep moving. When I got to the car, everything was as I left it. I threw the pack in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. I didn't even take off my boots. I just started driving. Took a long time before I felt safe again. Even on the highway, I kept checking the mirrors. When I got back to Phoenix, I took a long shower, turned my phone back on, and looked through the photos I took. The camp across the lake looked even more unsettling on screen. Like it didn't belong there. like it had been forgotten on purpose. I reported it to the Forest Service. I sent them the pictures and coordinates. They thanked me and said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. I think about that trip a lot, about the footsteps, the metal sounds, the abandoned camp. I don't know what happened there, and I'm not sure I want to, but I do know that someone had been there before me, and they didn't leave on their own terms. That trip taught me that the forest isn't just peaceful. It's also wild. It doesn't care who you are, how prepared you are, or how far you've come. Out there, you're just another part of the landscape, another shadow between the trees. It was in early September of 2018 when I took a solo trip out to a quiet, lesser-known area in the northwestern part of Colorado, near a stretch of land called Allen Ridge. I had just turned 34 and was going through a period in my life where I felt like everything was slipping sideways. My job at a regional supply chain company felt like it was eating me from the inside, and I hadn't spoken to any family members in months. I wasn't looking for anything grand out there, no finding myself sort of thing. I just needed silence. That kind of silence you only find in the woods, the kind that doesn't hum with traffic or overhead wires or TVs through the walls. I picked a spot about 2 hours drive from any major town, past Meeker, where the paved roads gave up and left you with washboard gravel paths. I had a few supplies in the back of my old gray Tacoma. Basic camping gear, some non-perishable food, a sleeping bag, a lightweight tent, water jugs, and a small cooler with dry ice to keep a few things cold for as long as I could. My plan was to be out there for 4 days, maybe 5 if the weather held. I arrived around late afternoon. The area I chose wasn't an official campsite, just a wide clearing about 30 yards from a bend in a shallow river. It looked like it had been used before, maybe once or twice, years ago. There were no fire rings or benches, just the subtle signs that someone had camped there a long time back. I parked my truck near a cluster of low pine trees and set up my tent close enough to the water that I could hear it if I left the flap open at night. The first night was peaceful. I ate cold beans straight from the can, walked along the riverbank barefoot in the twilight, and watched the shadows stretch until there weren't any more colors left in the sky. I lay down in the tent with my sleeping bag half-zipped and listened to the sounds outside. Crickets, wind, the occasional plop of a fish jumping or a branch falling. It was exactly what I needed, for a while anyway. On the second day, I woke up just before sunrise. It was cold, probably in the low 40s, and there was that sharp kind of mountain air that stings your nostrils when you breathe in too fast. I boiled some water over my small propane stove and made instant coffee while crouching on an old camp stool. The river carried a light fog over it, and the woods across the way were so still they felt painted on. I decided to do a bit of exploring after breakfast. I kept a small pack on me, just a compass, a pocket knife, some snacks, and a bottle of water, and followed a game trail upstream for about a mile. The path narrowed and weaved between thick groves of aspen and spruce. The deeper I went, the more it felt like no one had been through there in years. The ground was soft and spongy in places, like it stayed shaded from the sun most of the day. After maybe an hour, I reached a slight hill with a clearing at the top. It was mostly exposed granite and brush, but from there I could see over the treetops. In the far distance was the thin line of the county road I had driven in on, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. It was a good reminder of how far out I was. I sat down for a while, ate a couple of granola bars, then started back. On the way down, something caught my attention. A faint noise that didn't fit the usual rhythm of the forest. It was a clink like metal tapping metal. I stopped and stood still, listening hard. Came again, faint and irregular, not rhythmic like an animal. I moved slowly toward the sound, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches or slipping on moss. About 50 yards off the trail, tucked behind a cluster of fallen logs, I saw what looked like an old camping chair. Next to it was a rusted tin cup hanging from a nail in a tree. I stopped immediately. The scene looked old, weathered, sun-faded, but not ancient. The chair's fabric was torn, and the cup had visible rust streaks, but it hadn't been overtaken by vines or sunk into the ground. Couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 years old. maybe even less. I didn't go any closer. Something about the place felt abandoned but not forgotten. I turned back toward my own camp and took a wider route, circling back to the river. That evening, I sat near the fire pit I'd built and stared into the flames for hours, trying not to think about the chair. The third night is when things changed. I woke up in the dark, probably a little after midnight. It wasn't the cold that woke me or a sound. Exactly. It was the feeling that something was wrong. I lay perfectly still, ears wide open. For a long minute, I couldn't hear anything unusual. The river was still flowing, wind pushing gently through the trees. But then I noticed something strange. There were no animal sounds at all. No crickets, no owls, just wind and water. I stayed in the sleeping bag, my heart beating a little harder than usual. Then I heard it, a very soft crunch like a footstep on dry pine needles. It was faint and slow. Then another, closer. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the weak beam lighting up the inside of the tent. I didn't open the flap. I just stayed there, breathing as quietly as I could, waiting. Nothing else happened for a long time. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. I finally fell asleep again sometime before dawn, but I didn't rest much. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked a slow circle around my tent. Nothing was out of place. No prints, no damage, no signs of animals or people. I made breakfast and tried to push the night's fear out of my head. I even convinced myself to go back up the trail and explore a little more. Mostly because I didn't want to let fear shrink my world. I passed the place with the chair again, but this time gave it a wider berth. I moved up along the ridge and found a small overhang that overlooked the valley. I sat there for a long time. On the way back, I took a different route, moving down a shallow ravine that curved back toward the river. That's when I found something that shook me. At the base of the ravine, half hidden under brush and dead leaves, was a makeshift lean-to shelter. It was old but not ancient, the kind of thing you'd build if you were out there longer than a few days. It had a few rotted canvas sheets forming a roof, anchored with rocks and sticks. Inside were the remains of what looked like food wrappers, a cracked propane canister, and a small plastic water container, still half full but yellowed with age. There were also bones. Not human, thankfully, probably rabbit or squirrel, but they were piled neatly in a small tin pan, almost like someone had been collecting them. That's when I got the deep gut feeling that I wasn't alone out here. Not just in the animal sense, but someone had been living out here. Maybe still was. Maybe not full-time, but they'd been close. Closer than I liked. I hurried back to my camp, packed everything up into the truck, and decided I would sleep in the cab that night. I didn't want to drive the roads at night since they were steep and unlit, but I also didn't feel safe out in the open anymore. That night was long. I left the windows cracked a little and kept my headlamp within reach. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something again. Soft crunching footsteps. A slow shuffle through the needles and twigs just beyond the treeline. I turned on the headlamp and pointed it out the side window. Nothing, just the shifting silhouettes of trees. Then something tapped the back of the truck. Just once. A single, deliberate knock. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. I just sat there, headlamp beam pointed behind me, waiting. I never saw anyone. Never heard retreating steps. Nothing. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, I laid back down and stayed absolutely still. The morning came like a lifeline. I started the truck as soon as the sun lit the tops of the trees and drove out without eating or making coffee. I was about halfway down the gravel road when I passed an old, beat-up SUV coming in the opposite direction. It was the only vehicle I'd seen in days. The driver didn't wave. He just stared at me as he passed, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, face tight and unreadable. I didn't stop. I reached the main road by late morning and drove straight to a diner outside of Rifle. I ate a heavy breakfast, then sat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes just staring at the edge of the tree line in the distance. That night I stayed in a cheap motel and didn't sleep until almost 4 a.m. I never reported anything. What would I even say? That I found a chair and a weird shelter and heard noises? That someone knocked on my truck in the middle of the night? None of it broke the law. None of it proved anything. But I didn't go back to Allen Ridge. I didn't go camping again at all for 2 years. Even now, I only camp in designated sites with other people around. Sometimes I think about that chair, the bones in the tin pan, and that knock on the truck. Maybe it was just a drifter. Maybe it was someone who'd lost their grip on reality and decided to live out there, away from everything. Maybe they weren't trying to hurt me. Maybe the knock was just a warning. Either way, it worked. I got the message. I had planned the trip for months. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 25 years old. The woods near Pine Ridge, a quiet spot in northern Maine, were known for their deep forests and wild rivers, but not for anything scary. At least that's what I thought. I had been camping before, but never alone, never this deep into the wilderness. I wanted the solitude, the chance to be alone with my thoughts, far from the noise of the city. I packed my old green canvas backpack with the usual: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, some canned food, a first aid kit, and my trusty pocket knife. I left my phone at home. Cell coverage was spotty here anyway, and I wanted to disconnect. The drive from Portland was long, almost 4 hours on winding back roads. The closer I got to Pine Ridge, the fewer cars I saw, and the taller the trees grew. The air smelled fresher, cooler. When I finally reached the small dirt parking area at the trailhead, I unloaded my gear and double-checked my map. The plan was simple: hike about 6 miles into the forest to a clearing near a slow-moving river, set up camp, and spend 3 days alone. The trail started easy enough: a narrow dirt path, soft underfoot with pine needles and fallen leaves. Birds called out occasionally. The sun filtered through the branches, making dappled patterns on the ground. Felt peaceful. I had my boots tied tight, my backpack adjusted comfortably, and the steady rhythm of walking helped me clear my mind. Around 2 hours into the hike, I came to a small wooden footbridge crossing a shallow creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I stopped for a moment, crouched down, and cupped some water to drink. The forest around me was silent except for the creek's gentle rush. It felt like the kind of place people only visit to escape from everything. I crossed the bridge and continued on. The trail became less clear here, narrower and more overgrown. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and rough. I had to push past branches and duck under low-hanging limbs. I noticed small signs of wildlife: deer tracks in the mud, a squirrel's scratch marks on a fallen log, and bird feathers caught on bushes. Around midday, I reached the clearing I was looking for. It opened wide, bathed in sunlight, with tall grass swaying in the light breeze. The river curved gently around it, wide but slow, its surface reflecting the blue sky and fluffy white clouds. I dropped my pack and took a deep breath, feeling proud and calm. Setting up the tent was easy. The ground was soft but firm, perfect for stakes. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and arranged my gear carefully. I found some dry wood nearby for a fire and started gathering sticks and twigs. I always liked the routine of camping, the small tasks that grounded me. By late afternoon, the fire was crackling nicely. I boiled water for some instant soup and ate slowly, watching the river flow and the sun move behind the trees. The sounds of the forest changed as evening approached. Birds quieted down, replaced by the occasional rustle of small animals. The air cooled and smelled like earth and pine. I didn't bother lighting my flashlight much. I wanted to get used to the dark, to see the stars and hear the night. When the fire burned low, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag inside the tent and listened. For a long time, there was only silence except for the river and the wind. Then, as the night deepened, I heard it. A faint sound from somewhere beyond the trees. A rustling. A snapping twig, soft and slow. It wasn't the wind. My heart rate quickened a little. I stayed still, eyes wide, straining to see through the thin tent fabric. The forest seemed darker, more shadowed. The noise came again, a little closer this time. It wasn't fast, not like an animal running. It was deliberate, slow. Something was moving through the woods. I reminded myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe a bear even, though those usually made more noise. I wasn't scared, just alert. I reached for my pocket knife, kept close. The night air was cold against my skin through the thin tent fabric. The noise moved around the clearing, then stopped. The forest went quiet again. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted to sleep. Morning light crept into the tent and woke me. The sun was warm, and birds sang loudly now. I stepped out, stretched, and looked around. Everything seemed normal. My fire pit was cold, but there were new footprints in the soft earth near the clearing. I knelt down and studied them closely. They looked human, 2 sets of boots, maybe men's, size large. They were fresh, the mud still soft and moist. My stomach tightened. I had not seen anyone on the trail. I looked around carefully. No other signs, no trash, no dropped gear, just the footprints leading into the trees. My mind raced. I was alone here, or so I thought. What if someone had come here last night, watching me? I packed a little more food in my backpack and decided to explore the riverbank upstream, hoping to find a better view or maybe fresh water. The forest was thick and the ground uneven. I kept my knife ready and stayed alert. After about an hour, I found a small clearing near the water's edge. The river was wider here, with smooth rocks and deep pools. I took off my boots and waded in, feeling the cold water around my ankles. The sun was high now and the sky was bright. Then I saw it. About 50 yards downstream, a large fallen tree blocked part of the riverbank. Near the roots, something dark and rough lay, partly hidden by leaves. I moved closer cautiously and realized it was a backpack, heavy and worn. I pulled it free and unzipped it. Inside were empty cans, some broken gear, and a small notebook. The notebook was soaked, but some pages were still readable. The handwriting was hurried and messy. I flipped through and read a few words. Lost, help, darkness, noise. The last entry was cut off, smeared by water. Cold knot formed in my stomach. Someone else had been here recently, and from the notebook, they were scared. I looked around, ears straining for any sound. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. I stuffed the notebook back into the bag and decided to return to my camp. I moved quickly but carefully. On the way, I saw more footprints. They were scattered, some heading away from the river, some circling back. Back at camp, I checked my supplies and ate a quick lunch. I wanted to stay calm. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I had to be careful. I thought about leaving, but my car was too far, and the trail was long. I wasn't ready to panic yet. The afternoon passed slowly. I kept watch, scanning the treeline often. The sun dipped lower. The woods grew shadows and the air cooled. The quiet was heavy, thick. The noises I had heard at night returned, soft snaps, faint rustling. Just before sunset, I heard a new sound. A low, slow scraping noise, like someone dragging something over rocks. It came from the far side of the clearing. My heart hammered. I stood frozen, gripping my knife tightly. The sound stopped. Then the silence stretched, long and empty. I stayed still until the firelight was the only bright spot in the growing dark. The scraping returned, closer this time. My breath was shallow. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The noise stopped again. I decided to stay inside the tent. I zipped it up tight, piled my pack in front of the door, and sat with my back against the wall. The fire was nearly out, but the glow outside was enough to see shadows moving in the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel it. Eyes watching, waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Every noise made me jump. The scraping noise came again several times, always out of sight. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was a wild animal, or maybe the wind, but the footprints, the notebook, and the strange sounds told a different story. The next morning, I woke early and packed everything. I wanted to leave as soon as possible. I followed the trail quickly, eyes on every shadow. The forest seemed different now, colder, more threatening. About halfway back, I heard voices in the distance, low and angry. I couldn't see who they belonged to, but it was clear I wasn't alone out here. My pace quickened, and when I reached the footbridge again, I paused, looking back into the woods. No one was there, but I felt eyes on me. By the time I reached my car, sweat mixed with relief. I locked the doors and started the engine immediately. I didn't stop until the forest was far behind me. I never went back to Pine Ridge. I went camping alone in the summer of 2018, somewhere up north in Maine, just outside a place called Eustis. I was 31 then, tired of my desk job, worn out from too many hours staring at screens, and honestly just needed to feel like I was still a person. I'd been on a few solo trips before, but nothing too deep into the woods. That time, though, I wanted to really get away from everything. So I picked a spot that didn't have any cell signal. No marked trail nearby, just forest and hills and a lake that wasn't even labeled clearly on most maps. I found it by tracing satellite images on Google Earth the week before I left. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, portable water filter, camp stove, matches, flashlight, multi-tool, and my small first aid kit. Everything went into my big frame pack. I left my car at a gravel pull-off and started hiking west into the forest. It was early morning, quiet except for birds and the wind pushing through the trees. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a compass and had marked coordinates on a printed map. I felt good walking out there, alone and far from people. That was exactly what I'd wanted. By the time I reached the lake, it was late afternoon. The sun lit up the water and the trees glowed deep green in the reflection. The place was beautiful, like something out of a postcard. I found a flat spot about 30 feet from the water, shaded by a cluster of pine trees. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and ate a quick meal of canned chicken and rice. The first night was calm. I remember sitting on a rock by the lake, watching the sky turn orange and purple. I slept easy. The second day, I explored around the area. I walked along the lake's edge and found animal tracks. Deer, maybe some raccoon prints, nothing too large. I filled my bottle with filtered water, took a swim to cool off, and then dried in the sun on a boulder. I kept things relaxed. I didn't want this trip to feel rushed. I wanted to forget what time even was. That night, just after it got dark, I heard something in the woods behind my tent. It was soft, like footsteps, but not heavy. I figured it was probably a deer. I'd seen a few earlier in the distance. I turned off my lantern and sat still, listening. The sound stopped after maybe 10 seconds. Nothing else happened, and eventually I fell asleep. But it stuck with me. Not the sound itself, but how it had stopped so suddenly. No walking away, no fading into the trees. Just a full stop. On the third day, I hiked further out, following the shoreline and then cutting through some woods. I wasn't trying to get anywhere in particular. I just liked moving, hearing the crunch of pine needles and dry leaves under my boots. I carried a small day pack with water, a snack, and my knife. Around midday, I came across a strange clearing, maybe 50 feet wide, almost a perfect circle. No large trees, just ferns and low plants, and in the middle was a pile of stones. It looked deliberate, not natural. The stones were flat and stacked, like someone had made a small tower. It was only 3 feet high, but it had clearly been built carefully. There were no signs of people, no wrappers, no footprints, no broken branches, just that pile. I didn't touch it. Something about it made me feel like I shouldn't. Not fear exactly, but unease. It was the kind of thing that looks harmless but makes your skin crawl anyway. I didn't stay long there. I turned back toward camp and made it back around 4 in the afternoon. That night was quiet again. A little wind, the usual bugs, and nothing else. I fell asleep quickly but woke up maybe 2 hours later. My tent was zipped shut, but I felt like someone had been near it. I lay still, breathing slow, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I felt off, like something had brushed against the tent or passed by it. I stayed awake for at least an hour, eyes wide open, not moving. Then I must have drifted off. On the 4th day, I noticed something strange. A small change, but it bothered me. I always kept my gear organized. I had a routine. Cook by the fire pit, keep the food sealed in a bear-proof container 20 feet from the tent, hang my pack on a low branch, place my boots inside the tent at night. That morning, the boots were outside, side by side, clean, dry, like someone had moved them carefully. I didn't panic, but I was confused. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I'd left them out and imagined I didn't. Still, it didn't sit right. That afternoon, I decided to head back toward the clearing with the stones. I told myself I just wanted to look at it again, maybe figure out if it was a cairn or some kind of trail marker. But deep down, I wanted to know if anything had changed. I made it back to the spot after about an hour. The tower was still there, but now it was taller, at least by one more layer of stones. I was sure of it. I'd stared at that thing for minutes the first time. There was no way I missed that. I didn't go any closer. I just turned around and walked back, faster this time. The woods felt different. I don't mean darker or colder, just more tense. Like everything had gone silent, even the birds. I got back to camp and decided I wouldn't stay another night. I had enough food left, but something in my gut told me to pack up and head out early the next morning. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep much. I lay inside the tent, flashlight in my hand, listening to every tiny sound. At around midnight, I heard slow, steady steps outside. Not an animal, two-legged, careful. They came from the same direction as the lake, then circled the tent once, maybe twice. Then nothing. I waited an hour before unzipping the flap just a little and looking out with the light off. Nothing but trees and darkness. No sounds. I stayed like that until dawn, eyes barely shutting. When the first light came through the trees, I packed up fast. Tent, gear, everything shoved into the bag as quick as I could manage without leaving anything behind. I didn't eat, didn't even drink water. I just wanted to be moving. I hiked hard, not stopping except to catch my breath. I kept checking behind me, seeing nothing but still feeling watched. The forest was calm, too calm. I made it back to my car just after noon, chest tight, skin clammy with sweat, even though the air was cool. When I unlocked the door, I saw something on the hood. A rock, flat, gray, about the size of a hand. It hadn't been there when I left. I looked around the trees, expecting to see someone, but there was no movement, no voices. I left the rock on the ground, got in, and drove off fast, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement. Back at home, I spent the evening checking every door, every window, like some paranoid shut-in. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't have anything concrete to say anyway. No proof, no pictures, nothing that would sound serious. Just feelings and a rock. But I couldn't shake the idea that someone had been out there, watching me the whole time, maybe even following me, waiting for something. That tower in the clearing still haunts me sometimes, especially how it had grown. A week later, I took my pack out to check everything, thinking I might have missed something. The boots were still clean, but I found something in the small outer pocket I rarely use. A folded piece of cloth, brown, thin, about the size of a napkin. I didn't own it. It wasn't part of my gear. It smelled like dirt and smoke. I threw it out immediately and washed my hands twice. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still go out sometimes, but always with someone else, and never in places that remote. I've thought about going back to that lake, maybe with a group, maybe to figure out what the hell really happened out there. But then I remember those footsteps circling my tent, the rock on my car, and the way the forest held its breath like it didn't want me there. And I decide not to. What got to me wasn't fear of being hurt. It was the thought that someone had been so close, so quiet, and I never saw them. I still don't know if they were just watching or if they were waiting for something. Either way, I'm done with solo trips. Whatever was out there, human or not, it knew how to stay hidden. And I was the one out of place. I was the one being tracked. That's what scared me the most, that I didn't realize it until it was almost too late. I went on a solo camping trip in September 2017. I was 32 at the time, living in Lincoln, Nebraska, and working a maintenance job at the airport. I had just gone through a rough breakup earlier that summer and felt like I needed some quiet. Not the kind you find at home with the windows closed, but real quiet, no phones, no people, no noise. I needed to get away from everything for a few days. I'd always enjoyed hiking and had done a lot of short overnights in the past, but I had never taken a long solo trip before. I figured it was time. I planned to drive west and spend 4 nights in the Nebraska National Forest. Most people don't even realize Nebraska has a national forest, but it does. It's not huge, and a lot of it's planted rather than naturally occurring, but it's remote enough to be silent at night, and there are parts of it that hardly anyone ever visits. I picked a section of the forest near the Dismal River, far from any towns. I had to drive about 5 hours from Lincoln, then another 40 minutes on gravel roads. I parked near a barely visible pull-off, left a note in my truck saying when I planned to be back, and hiked in. I had a map printed from a PDF I got off the Forest Service website. No GPS. I didn't want to rely on batteries. I packed light but brought enough to last me the 5 days: food, water filtration, tent, sleeping bag, basic first aid, bear spray just in case, even though there aren't really bears in that area. The first day went fine. I hiked about 7 miles into the woods before setting up my tent. The terrain was rolling and dry, with tall pine trees and soft dirt trails. It was late enough in the year that the mosquitoes were mostly gone. I saw a couple of deer, a fox near a dry creek bed, and a ton of squirrels. The sun went down around 7:30, and by 8, it was pitch black. I cooked some freeze-dried pasta, ate, and sat quietly outside my tent for a while, listening. The wind barely moved through the trees, and I could hear nothing but the occasional crack of a branch. I slept well that first night. The second day I hiked farther, following an old trail that didn't show up on the map. It looked unused for years, overgrown in places, but it was clear enough that I could follow it without getting lost. The trees got denser in that section of the forest, and the sun came through in narrow beams. I felt like I was deep inside a forgotten corner of the state. No people, no trash, not even signs of recent animal activity. Around late afternoon, I found a small flat spot near a line of mossy rocks and set up my tent. I filtered water from a shallow stream nearby. Tasted a little metallic, but was fine. After eating, I walked around a bit before it got dark, just looking at trees and getting a feel for the area. It was beautiful in a very quiet, lonely way. The kind of place you could stay forever if you didn't mind being completely alone. That night, I woke up at some point, I'd guess maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I couldn't hear anything at first. Then I noticed the wind had stopped completely. The forest was totally still, and that was what made me open my eyes. It's a weird thing, but sometimes it's the absence of sound that wakes you up, not the presence of it. I lay there for a while, listening. Then I heard its slow, crunching footsteps on the dry ground, maybe 30 feet away. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately. I reached slowly for the can of bear spray near my sleeping bag and held it close. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too slow, too heavy. I heard them stop, then take a few more steps, then stop again. I stayed still for what felt like 20 minutes, but might have only been 5. Eventually, the steps faded. I never heard them go in one direction. They just faded into the background, like they were never there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes open, ears straining. By sunrise, I hadn't slept again, and I was exhausted. I stepped out of the tent slowly and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs that anything had come near. I told myself it was probably a deer walking oddly, or maybe my tired brain playing tricks. But something in me didn't fully believe that. I packed up and kept hiking, deciding to loop back slowly toward the truck over the next 2 days instead of staying out longer. I told myself I was just being cautious. The third day felt off from the start. The air seemed heavier, not humid, just still. The sky stayed a dull gray all morning, and everything felt a little more closed in. I moved quietly, stopping often to listen. I hadn't seen a single other person since leaving my truck, which was the plan, but now it was starting to feel like a bad idea. Around midday, I passed through an area with burnt stumps and fallen trees. Looked like it had been hit by a small fire years ago. I moved quickly through it. The open ground made me feel exposed. Later that afternoon, I stopped for a break near a dry wash. I was sitting on a rock, drinking filtered water, when I noticed something up on a small ridge maybe 40 yards away. I couldn't tell exactly what it was at first. It wasn't moving. I stared at it, and the longer I looked, the more I thought it looked like a person crouched down, facing away. But it wasn't moving, just completely still. My stomach dropped. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I stood up slowly, scanned the ridge for 5 full minutes, and saw nothing. No movement, no sign anything had ever been there. I backed away from that area fast, walked for another 2 hours, and didn't stop again until I found a small hollow between 2 hills where I could set up camp mostly out of sight. I skipped dinner. I didn't want to do anything that made noise or smell. I just lay in the tent, fully clothed, holding the bear spray again. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing faint snaps of twigs, far off and irregular. It might have been animals, but the spacing between the sounds seemed deliberate. One near midnight, another 20 minutes later, then 2 in a row, always distant but never gone completely. At some point in the early morning, I must have drifted off because I woke with a jolt at sunrise to the sound of nothing. Just the regular morning quiet, birds chirping, leaves rustling. It was almost worse than the silence the night before. I packed up in record time and started hiking again. I had 1 day left and planned to head straight back to the truck, even if it meant walking over 12 miles. I didn't stop.
He barely drank.
I just moved fast. My eyes kept scanning behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there anymore. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I noticed something strange, fresh boot prints in a patch of soft dirt. Not mine, not where I had walked coming in. These were larger than my boots, a different tread pattern. They followed roughly the same path I was taking, but they were older, maybe a few hours. I crouched down and studied them. There were a lot of them, the same boot print, repeating, wandering slightly side to side, like someone unsure of where they were going. I stood up and walked faster. By now the sun was low, and I didn't want to be out there after dark again. I didn't stop until I saw my truck through the trees. It was untouched, no signs of forced entry. The note I'd left on the dashboard was still there. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and drove away fast, bouncing along the gravel road until I hit pavement. I didn't stop driving until I got to a gas station in Thetford. I sat there in the parking lot for a while, drinking a warm energy drink and just trying to breathe normally. It wasn't until I got back to Lincoln that I really processed it. Something or someone had been out there, watching, following, maybe just curious, maybe worse. I never saw them clearly, but I know what I felt. I didn't report it. What would I say? I never saw a crime, just a shadow on a ridge, a pair of boots that didn't belong, footsteps in the dark. I told myself maybe it was a drifter, maybe another camper who didn't want to be seen. But even now, years later, I know something was off. That forest felt empty when I went in. By the 3rd night, it didn't anymore. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike. I still love the woods. But I don't go deep like that. Not without a group. Not without signal. That trip taught me something I didn't really understand before. How fragile you are when you're truly alone. Not because of animals or weather. Because of people. People you don't see. People who don't want to be seen. People who wait in the quiet, in places no one else goes, where there's no help coming and no reason behind anything they do. That trip changed how I feel about silence. I used to crave it. Now, too much of it makes me uneasy, because once you've heard footsteps where there shouldn't be any, silence stops feeling peaceful. It starts feeling like something that's waiting. I was 28 years old when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I had spent most of my life in cities and small towns, always surrounded by people, noise, and the constant buzz of daily life. But after a rough year, lost jobs, bad relationships, and constant pressure, I craved solitude and nature. I wanted to be somewhere far away from everything, to hear nothing but the wind and the trees. I planned a solo trip to the remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. somewhere I could be alone and disconnected. It was early October in 2019 when I set off. The fall colors were at their peak. Bright reds, oranges, and yellows splashed across the forest canopy like a giant painting. The air was crisp, cool, and fresh, the kind that makes you want to breathe deeper than usual. I packed light, carrying a small backpack with essentials. A tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a portable stove, water, some canned food, a map, a compass, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. No cell phone service for miles, so I made sure to leave word with a friend about my plans and when I'd return. The drive up was quiet except for the occasional radio station playing classic rock songs that reminded me of better times. I stopped once at a small gas station near the base of the mountains, bought some snacks and water, then turned off the main road and onto a dirt path leading to the trailhead. The trail was supposed to be about 8 miles long, ending at a small clearing by a shallow creek where I planned to camp. According to the map, the spot was far enough from the main trails to guarantee privacy, but still accessible and safe. The hike started easy enough. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush kept me company. I walked steadily, taking in the beauty around me. The jagged rocks, the tall trees stretching toward the sky, the patches of moss and wildflowers. The scent of pine mixed with damp earth was intoxicating. I passed a few small campsites, empty now, with ashes from old fires and discarded cans. It reminded me that people had been here before, but I saw no one. About 3 hours into the hike, the trail began to climb sharply. The terrain grew rougher, with roots and loose stones making footing tricky. I had to watch every step carefully, especially when crossing narrow wooden bridges over shallow streams. My legs grew tired, but the thought of reaching my camping spot kept me moving. By late afternoon, I arrived at the clearing near the creek. It was exactly as the map had promised. Secluded, peaceful, surrounded by tall oaks and maples. The creek babbled softly nearby, water clear enough to see small fish darting between rocks. I took a deep breath and felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was what I needed. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, a few yards from the water, but far enough to avoid any overnight flooding. I unpacked my gear, made a small fire pit, and gathered dry wood from around the area. The light was fading, and the temperature was dropping quickly as the sun dipped behind the mountains. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice on my stove, savoring the quietness around me. As darkness settled, the forest transformed. The daytime sounds faded into a deep, eerie silence broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant howl of a coyote. I sat near the fire for a while, watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth on my face. The isolation started to sink in. There was no one else here. No cell service, no radios, no cars, just me and the wilderness. It felt peaceful, but also made me hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and stretch, playing tricks on my eyes. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., zipped it up tight, and laid down on my sleeping pad. The night air was cold but bearable with my sleeping bag zipped up to my chin. I listened to the creek's steady murmur and tried to calm my racing mind. Sleep came slowly. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise outside the tent. It was a soft rustling, like something moving through the leaves or branches. I stayed still, heart pounding, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. A crunch of dry leaves underfoot, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind or any animal I knew. It felt like a person moving quietly, stalking. I froze, unsure what to do. I didn't want to make noise and reveal my presence if someone was nearby. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself. The beam might attract attention. Instead, I held my breath and listened. The rustling moved around the tent's perimeter, circling slowly, stopping and starting. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, shallow and uneven. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a hunter, a hiker lost in the dark, or something worse? I tried to calm myself, remembering the advice to stay put and make noise if threatened. But I also knew I was alone and vulnerable. The fire had died down to embers long ago, so there was no light or warmth outside. The rustling stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with tension. Minutes passed like hours. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard a faint knock on the side of my tent, 3 soft taps. My heart leapt. I gripped my flashlight, debating whether to shine it outside or call out. I didn't want to be rude or scared, but the thought of opening the tent to a stranger in the middle of nowhere was terrifying. The knocks came again, same rhythm, then stopped. I stayed frozen, listening for any more sounds. Nothing. No footsteps retreating, no rustling, nothing. I lay awake the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight, eyes wide open. The fear didn't come from anything supernatural, just the raw, human fear of being alone and possibly in danger, miles from help. When dawn finally arrived, pale light filtered through the tent's fabric. I unzipped the flap cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of anyone around. The campsite looked exactly as I had left it. I packed up quickly, still feeling jittery but relieved to be leaving. The hike back to the trailhead felt different. Every shadow and sound was sharper, more threatening. I kept my eyes peeled, my pace quickened. About halfway down the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On a tree just off the path, someone had carved 3 vertical lines, like tally marks, deep into the bark. They looked fresh, the cuts sharp and dark. I knew they hadn't been there earlier. The thought of someone else lurking nearby, watching me, unsettled me. I kept moving without looking back, adrenaline pushing me forward. When I finally reached my car hours later, I felt an overwhelming mix of exhaustion and relief. I drove straight home, vowing never to camp alone in such an isolated place again. That experience stayed with me for a long time, not because of any ghost story or legend, but because it reminded me how vulnerable we can be in the wild, how real danger doesn't have to come from monsters or spirits, but from other people. The forest, beautiful as it was, held secrets, and sometimes those secrets were very close. Since then, I stick to well-traveled trails and campgrounds with other people around. I still love nature, but I've learned to respect its quiet dangers, especially when I'm alone. The marks on that tree, the tapping on my tent, whatever it was, never made sense. I never saw anyone or found any explanation. But that night taught me the most important lesson of all. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and never underestimate the power of being truly alone. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to spend a few days alone in the woods near the Canadian border, just outside a small town called Hardell in northern Minnesota. I was 32 at the time, working in an office job that drained the life out of me every weekday. I'd taken 2 weeks off for vacation, and instead of going somewhere loud or touristy, I packed up my old Ford truck, tossed in my tent, sleeping bag, stove, and enough food to last me 5 days, and drove about 5 hours north from where I lived in Duluth. I wanted solitude, quiet, no phones, no people, just me and the trees. The trailhead to the spot I had in mind wasn't anything official, just a turnoff along a gravel road leading into state-managed forest land. I had discovered it a couple years back with an old friend, and we'd marked a good spot about 2 miles in with a flat clearing near a creek, hidden behind a thick wall of trees. It was perfect for someone wanting real isolation. No campgrounds, no fire pits, no rangers, just deep forest that didn't see many visitors. I parked off the gravel road, loaded my pack, double-checked my gear, and locked the truck. The first mile in was quiet except for the usual forest sounds. Birds high in the canopy, the hum of insects, wind pushing through leaves like water. There were no other cars nearby, no boot tracks on the soft trail. That was what I wanted. I remember feeling calm as I hiked in, my shoulders loosening up after months of office tension. The weather was warm, sunny but not too hot, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes at bay. By the time I reached the clearing near the creek, it was around 4 p.m. The site was just how I remembered it. A wide patch of level dirt surrounded by tall spruce and pine. The stream babbled quietly about 20 feet away, lined with smooth rocks. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, organized my food into a bear canister, and stashed it a good distance from the tent. I had cell service at the car, but nothing out here, which was fine by me. That was part of the plan. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some rice and beans, sat near the water, and watched the last bit of sunlight bleed through the branches. Then crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and trickling water. It was the second day when things started to feel off. I woke up with the sun, made some instant coffee and oatmeal, and decided to hike a bit further upstream to explore. I brought my knife, a small day pack with water and snacks, and my compass, but left most of my gear at the campsite. The forest was thicker along the stream, with dense patches of undergrowth and downed trees that forced me to zigzag around. I saw signs of deer, fresh tracks in the mud, some droppings, and heard a woodpecker hammering somewhere nearby. It all felt normal until I came across what looked like an old, overgrown fire ring about a mile upstream. It was just a shallow circle of blackened rocks, some melted glass, rusted metal bits, and the remains of burnt cans. It had clearly been there a while, probably a poacher's or squatter's old site. Nothing unusual in remote woods like these. But what caught my eye was a torn piece of cloth stuck to a branch nearby. Faded, dirty, like denim, maybe a pant leg. Something about it made my skin crawl. I don't know why, but I turned around and headed straight back to my camp without stopping to eat. That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The forest, which had felt peaceful the day before, suddenly felt too quiet. No wind, no frogs or birds. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the fabric ceiling, listening. I thought I heard a faint crunching sound at some point in the night, like something stepping on dried needles or branches. But when I sat up and held my breath, I didn't hear it again. Could have been a raccoon, a deer, anything. The next morning, I found one of the small rocks I had placed around my tent entrance was missing. I'd done that out of habit, to form a little path and keep the corners of the fly secure. At first I thought maybe I kicked it away somehow, but I looked around and couldn't find it nearby. It was about the size of a grapefruit, not something that would roll far. I told myself it didn't matter. Later that day, I walked back out toward the gravel road to check on my truck, just for peace of mind. The forest felt thicker than before, heavier, like the trees were pressing in. When I got to the truck, it was just as I left it, but I noticed something I hadn't before. Some fresh scuff marks on the driver's side door, low to the ground, like something metal or rough had scraped against it. I crouched down and looked closer. It wasn't from a tree branch or rock. It looked more like scratches, but too wide to be from an animal. It looked like it had been made by a tool. There were 4 shallow gouges, vertical, maybe half an inch apart. I backed away and scanned the road. No one, no tire tracks besides mine. Just dry gravel and a long, quiet stretch of trees. I didn't see any broken glass, no sign of forced entry. I opened the truck, checked inside. Everything was where I left it. I sat in the driver's seat and thought about packing up and leaving. But I told myself it was probably nothing. Just old damage I hadn't noticed. Maybe I scraped something driving in. I didn't want to be paranoid. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint pops and cracks in the woods around my tent. Some of them might have been normal, twigs falling, small animals, but I heard something else too. Something heavier, slower. I clicked on my headlamp and listened, holding the handle of my knife. I didn't dare unzip the tent. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke up around dawn with a stiff neck and the light just starting to filter through the trees. When I got out of the tent, I saw a partial boot print near where I kept the bear canister. It was deep and wide, someone wearing heavy boots, not a hiker's trail shoe. My heart started thumping. I hadn't seen a single person in 2 days. The print wasn't there yesterday. The ground had been dry and undisturbed. Now it was clear as day, just one print, facing the trees like someone had been standing there. I packed up within 10 minutes. I didn't even cook breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack, tied it down, grabbed the bear canister, and hiked out fast and quiet. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened, holding my breath, waiting for movement. But the forest was dead silent. When I reached the truck, the scratches on the door were still there, but nothing else looked touched. I tossed my gear in the bed, jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The gravel road back out to the highway felt longer than before. Every curve felt like it was hiding someone. Once I was back in Hardell, I drove to the diner on the edge of town and parked in their lot just to sit among people for a few minutes. I watched cars go by, listened to someone laugh inside. I finally felt the tension start to leave my shoulders. I was safe again. I drove home to Duluth and didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not for a long time. A few months later, I looked up that area on some hunting forums just out of curiosity. I found a few mentions from people saying to avoid the old fire roads near that forest. Nothing detailed, just warnings. One guy said his trail cam had been stolen twice in the same spot. Another mentioned signs of squatter activity near one of the streams, including piles of bones and makeshift camps. I don't know if it was someone living out there or just passing through. I didn't want to know. What I do know is that I wasn't alone out there. Someone was watching me, walking around my camp, checking my truck. They didn't take anything. They didn't confront me, but they made sure I knew they were there. I've been camping plenty of times since then, but never alone, and never in places that remote. Now I go to designated sites, places with other people, places with cell service. I still love the forest, but I don't trust it like I used to. I learned that some parts of the woods aren't empty, and when something feels wrong out there, it usually is. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 33 at the time. I had been working in tech for nearly a decade, mostly behind a desk, spending my days staring at screens and shuffling through emails. After a rough stretch of months, tight deadlines, late hours, and too many energy drinks, I decided to take a break. A real one. Not a weekend getaway, not a spa day, but something that would get me as far away from the buzz of notifications as possible. I picked a camping trip. Just me, a tent, and the woods. I'd grown up in upstate New York, but I'd moved to Seattle years ago for work. I found a campground in northern Idaho, near the Canadian border, called McCrae Hollow. It was remote, surrounded by thick pine forests and dotted with small lakes. It wasn't part of any big tourist route, and from everything I read, it was usually quiet. That's what I needed. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, stove, first aid kit, flashlight, a hunting knife, bear spray, and a notebook I'd been meaning to fill for years. I didn't take a gun. I didn't own one, and I thought I wouldn't need one. I parked my car at the trailhead just after 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. There was only one other car parked, a dusty old Subaru with Colorado plates, and no sign of anyone around. The air was crisp and dry. The sky was cloudless. I started hiking, following a narrow trail that weaved through towering pines and spruce trees. It took me about 3 hours to reach the camping area I'd scoped out on the map. It wasn't a marked site, just a small clearing by a stream that fed into a nearby lake called Pineglass Lake. The water was clear and still. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird flitting from one branch to another. I set up camp quickly. Tent pitched, food hung from a tree branch, water filtered from the stream. The first day passed slowly. I took a walk along the water, made dinner on my little stove, and sat by the fire watching the sky change from blue to orange to black. I slept surprisingly well that first night, wrapped tight in my sleeping bag with the soft sound of water flowing nearby. The second day, I hiked to a higher ridge that overlooked the valley. I spotted a couple of deer, a raccoon, and what I think was a fox darting through the brush. Felt peaceful. I made it back to camp before dusk and spent some time scribbling in my notebook. I wrote about the trees, the silence, the way the air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. But later that night, just after I lay down to sleep, I heard something strange. At first, it was just a rustling noise. I figured it was wind in the branches or maybe a raccoon poking around, but it didn't sound quite right. The sound was low to the ground and heavy, like someone dragging something slowly through dry leaves. It started near the stream, moved through the brush, then stopped. I lay completely still, ears straining. No footsteps, no breathing, just silence. I finally convinced myself it was some animal and fell asleep, though not as deeply as the night before. The next morning, I checked around camp. Nothing was touched. My food was still hanging, untouched. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was a deer or a bear passing through. Still, I kept my knife clipped to my belt and my bear spray within reach for the rest of the day. On the third day, I decided to stay close to camp. My legs were sore from all the hiking and I wanted to spend time writing. I walked down to the lake in the morning and sat on a flat rock near the water, sketching the trees and rocks around me. Around noon, I noticed something odd upstream. About 30 yards from where I was sitting, across the stream and halfway up the hill, I saw what looked like a tree stump that wasn't there the day before. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't moving, but something about it didn't sit right with me. After a while, I got up and hiked over to it. It wasn't a stump. It was a pile of bark and branches stacked carefully in a shape that looked like a small shelter or blind, barely noticeable unless you were looking straight at it. Inside, I found something worse, the bones of small animals. Birds, maybe rabbits, stripped clean, arranged in a little pile. I backed away slowly and returned to camp, uneasy now. I didn't touch it. I didn't take a picture. I just packed some of my things tighter, and when I sat by the fire that night, I couldn't stop glancing into the trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard it again, that dragging noise, but closer, right outside my tent. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, eyes wide in the dark. I could hear the soft scrape of something being pulled along the dirt. Then it stopped. For maybe 5 or 6 minutes, there was nothing. Just my heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard what sounded like quiet footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. 1 round, then 2, then nothing. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but it felt like forever. I didn't dare move. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly. There were faint tracks around the tent, just depressions in the dirt, but not shaped like any animal I knew. Not paws, not hooves. Almost like bare feet, but off. Too wide, toes too spread. The dragging trail led toward the stream, then vanished into the underbrush. I wanted to leave right then, but part of me didn't want to panic. Maybe it was an animal, maybe I imagined the footsteps. I told myself I'd stay 1 more night and hike out first thing in the morning. But I couldn't sit still. I packed up most of my gear before noon, made sure everything was ready to grab quickly if I needed to leave fast. That evening, I made a small fire early and sat by it, gripping my knife, staring into the woods. I didn't eat much. I didn't write anything. I just waited for night to fall. As the fire died down, I heard the sound again. First near the stream, then closer, then to the left of my camp. It wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The dragging was louder. The footsteps were heavier. I stood up and backed toward my tent, unsure what I was going to do. Then I saw movement between the trees. Just a flash, a figure, low to the ground. It darted behind a tree before I could make out details. Then another flash to the right. Then silence again. I grabbed my bag, left the tent behind, and bolted. I didn't use the trail. I ran straight through the woods, ducking under branches, stumbling over roots. I don't know how far I ran, maybe a mile, maybe more. I stopped only when I couldn't hear anything but my own gasping. I found a dense thicket and hid inside, curled up with my pack. I stayed there all night, shivering and sweating, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other. Every sound made me jump. I didn't sleep. At sunrise, I picked a direction and started walking. I found the trail again after a couple of hours. By noon, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there. The other car, the Subaru with Colorado plates, was still there too. But something was off. The windows were dirty, the tires partially sunk into the gravel like it hadn't moved in days. I glanced inside as I passed. The back seat was packed with gear, food, a sleeping bag, a map, but there was a faint smell coming from it. I didn't stay to investigate. I drove nonstop until I was back in Spokane. I checked into a hotel and stayed there for 2 nights before flying home. I never reported anything. I don't know what I would have said. I didn't see a crime, and I didn't have proof of anything. Just noises, footprints, and something hiding in the woods. Something building shelters out of bark. Something watching. I haven't been camping since. I gave away most of my gear. The notebook is still empty, except for a few pages filled with trees and stream notes. Sometimes I dream about that sound. The dragging noise, the slow footsteps around my tent. I can still feel the way the air changed that last night. How quiet it got, like the whole forest was holding its breath. And the worst part is, I still wonder what was in that blind. What was building it, what it was waiting for. But I made it out. I never went back. That's enough for me. I was 34 in the summer of 2021 when I decided to spend a few days off the grid, alone in the woods outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I'd been working long hours as a flooring contractor in Spokane for the better part of a year without taking any proper time to myself. My neck and lower back were always tight, my head was always buzzing with stress, and the city noise started to feel heavier each day. So when July rolled around and I finally had a week off, I knew I didn't want to go somewhere packed with people or even moderately social. I wanted quiet. I wanted trees and wind and water and dirt. I wanted to hear nothing but my own footsteps. I'd been to Hayden Lake a few times when I was younger, so I knew roughly what was in the area, but I wanted to go deeper, farther from the roads and trails most people used. After a bit of digging around on old maps and talking to a guy at an outdoor gear shop, I learned about a less traveled patch of forest land northeast of the lake. It wasn't a formal campground. No amenities, no marked trails, and technically it was a bit beyond the regulated forest boundaries. But it was legal to camp there as long as you respected the land. That was perfect for me. I packed my gear over the course of 2 days. I didn't need much, just the basics. A canvas tent, a small sleeping mat, my old mummy-style sleeping bag, plenty of dehydrated food, a few gallons of water in thick plastic jugs, a small propane stove, a headlamp, and my trusty old 10-inch hunting knife. I didn't bother with a gun. I wasn't going that deep into grizzly country, but I did pack a flare gun just in case. I also brought a basic first aid kit, an emergency whistle, and my phone, even though I knew service would be dead out there. I left on a Monday morning around 6. I stopped once for gas and again for a quick breakfast sandwich, then drove north past Hayden Lake and onto a series of narrowing roads. The final stretch was a gravel logging road with no markings except for some faded orange ribbons tied to tree branches now and then. I followed it slowly, watching the trees get thicker and the road get rougher. After about an hour, I found a small turnout that looked like it had been used by other campers before. The ground was relatively flat, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. I pulled my truck off the road, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. The silence was incredible. No engines, no planes, no people. Just wind moving through trees and the occasional clicking of bugs. It took about 40 minutes to set up camp. I staked the tent into a soft patch of ground slightly uphill from the truck and laid out my mat and sleeping bag inside. The air smelled like dried pine needles and dirt. Everything felt clean. I put my food in a metal container and stashed it under a makeshift shelter made of sticks and tarp, about 20 yards from the tent, to avoid drawing in any curious animals. After that, I just walked for a while. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the area. There were no paths, just dense forest, with thick ferns and soft, uneven ground. I spent the rest of the day settling in. I read for a while, wrote a few notes in a small pocket notebook I'd brought, and made some simple food before turning in around 10. The tent creaked softly in the wind that night, and I fell asleep quicker than I expected. The first 2 days passed easily. I hiked through the woods, cooked small meals, filtered water from a nearby stream, and mostly just listened to the quiet. The only signs of life I saw were a couple of deer tracks near the stream and some distant coyote calls after dark. I kept my trash in sealed bags and buried the waste properly. I didn't see another person, and I didn't want to. It wasn't until the third night that I started to notice things that didn't sit right with me. I was lying in my tent with my headlamp turned off, just listening to the forest. Usually, the woods go through waves of sound. Frogs, wind, crickets, then silence, then it all comes back again. But this time, everything stopped at once. It wasn't gradual. One moment I could hear the usual hum of bugs and wind in the trees, and the next it was just blank. I opened my eyes and sat up. I thought maybe a big animal had moved nearby, something that made everything else go quiet. I stayed still for a while, straining to hear. There was nothing, not even wind. Then I heard a sound I didn't like. A slow, steady crunching, like boots pressing into dry pine needles. Not a deer, not fast or erratic, just a steady, careful movement. It came from somewhere downslope, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. I turned on my headlamp and pointed it toward the tent wall, but I knew I wouldn't see anything through it. I waited. The steps paused for a moment, then moved again, closer, then away, then closer again, like someone circling slowly. I held my breath, knife in my hand. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. I waited another 30 minutes, still frozen in place. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, sweeping my light around. Nothing. No shapes, no movement, no sound. I checked the area and even walked down toward where the steps had come from, but I didn't see anything, just more woods. I stayed up most of the night after that. In the morning, I checked around the site again. I didn't see footprints, which wasn't surprising. The forest floor was soft and covered in loose debris, but something felt off. The food stash was untouched, but the tarp over it had shifted slightly, like someone had tugged at it. Couldn't be sure, though. Maybe it was the wind. Still, I told myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks. I hadn't seen anyone, and I was out in the open. If someone was watching, they could have done anything they wanted that night. They didn't. That was comforting, in a strange way. I pushed the thoughts away and tried to enjoy the day. That night, the sounds came back. Same slow footsteps, same pattern. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a dream. It circled farther this time, not right up on the tent. I didn't hear any breathing or whispering, just those slow, measured steps. I didn't turn on the light. I sat with the knife in hand again, heart racing. At some point, the sound stopped, and I dozed off from pure exhaustion. In the morning, I made a decision to leave the next day. I didn't want to panic, but something didn't feel right, and I didn't like the idea of staying another night in case things escalated. I packed up most of my gear, loaded it into the truck, and left just the bare essentials for one more night. I figured I'd get some sleep, wake up early, and leave at first light. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sound again, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. The steps weren't circling anymore. They were coming directly toward the tent. My heart was pounding in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped maybe 10 feet from me. I could hear faint rustling, like someone shifting their weight. Then I heard the softest, slowest sound of fabric, a tent zipper moving slightly. Not mine, somewhere near the edge of camp. I reached for my flare gun and held it with both hands. I waited. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, after a long time, I clicked the flare gun safety off, threw open the tent, and fired the flare straight into the sky. The sudden light lit up the trees like a red explosion, sending shadows in every direction. For a second, everything was visible. I didn't see anyone, but I saw something that stopped my blood cold. Over by the edge of the woods, near the food tarp, there was a shape. A small dome tent, one that hadn't been there the night before. It was tan, blending into the trees. I stared at it, not blinking. It looked older, faded, and half-collapsed. I didn't hear anyone inside it, but I didn't need to. Someone had been camping less than 50 feet from me. The whole time, I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything I could into it, and ran straight to the truck. I didn't bother folding the tent or cleaning up. I started the engine and drove straight out, pushing the truck through rough ground and low-hanging branches. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I reported what I saw to a local ranger's office later that day. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I never heard anything back. Maybe it was some hermit, maybe someone squatting illegally, or maybe something worse. I didn't want to know. I never went back. I still camp sometimes, but only in places where I can see other people nearby, where there's noise and signs of life and places to go for help if I need to. I still think about that tent sometimes, about the quiet steps in the dark, about how easy it would have been for someone to walk right up and unzip mine without a sound. and I keep asking myself the same question over and over. How long was he there before I noticed? It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 32 then, and after years of working in a cramped office in downtown Portland, Oregon, I felt worn down and drained. I needed to get away from everything, the noise, the endless crowds, the constant rush. So I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of the Cascade Mountains. The place was far enough from any town that you couldn't hear cars or sirens, just the sounds of nature. The kind of place where you could almost forget the world existed. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Built sometime in the late 1960s, it had rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch that wrapped around two sides. The windows were thick and covered with heavy curtains, and there was a single door with an old iron latch. The road to get there was a bumpy dirt path that twisted through dense pine trees, and the only signs of human life were an abandoned fire pit and a faded wooden sign that read Clearview Cabin. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and the air was cool and damp. I carried my backpack, a small cooler, and a stack of firewood up to the cabin. As I opened the door, a faint smell of pine mixed with old wood filled my nose. The floor creaked under my boots as I stepped inside, setting down my things. The cabin was empty, except for a simple wooden table, two chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a small stove. There was no electricity, no running water. Just the basics. I set to work making the place feel livable. I stacked the firewood by the hearth and started a small fire to warm the room. Outside, I could hear birds chirping and the distant rustle of animals moving through the brush. The sky darkened quickly, and soon I was sitting by the firelight, reading a paperback book I brought along. The silence outside was deep, different from the usual city quiet. It wasn't empty, it felt alive, watching. The first night was strange but not frightening. I woke several times, hearing the sounds of branches tapping the cabin's walls and small animals scurrying nearby. I told myself it was just the forest doing what forests do, but there was a knot in my stomach I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease. Something was off. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight. The sun was bright and warm as I walked through the thick woods, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. The trees were tall, their tops lost in a haze of green. I followed an old trail that curved away from the cabin, hoping to find a stream or maybe a clearing. After about an hour, I stumbled upon an old logging road, barely visible through the overgrowth. It looked like no one had used it for years. The air smelled wetter here, and I could hear the faint sound of running water. I pushed forward, the bushes scraping my arms. When I finally broke through the trees, I found a small creek, the water clear and cold as it bubbled over smooth stones. I sat by the creek for a while, soaking in the peace. The light filtered through the branches in bright patches, and I watched a pair of squirrels dart from tree to tree. It felt like the kind of place where time stood still. After a while, I stood and headed back toward the cabin, careful to mark my path so I wouldn't get lost. That evening, as the sky darkened, I made a bigger fire outside on the porch and cooked some canned beans over it. The stars were bright and scattered across the sky like diamonds. I felt a rare calm, but that knot in my stomach was still there, tightening a little. The third day was when things started to feel truly wrong. I woke early to the sound of something scratching outside. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or maybe a bird pecking at the wood. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. The forest was still, the trees silent in the morning light. I told myself again it was just an animal, nothing more. I spent the day reading and exploring more around the cabin. I found an old hunting trail not far from the logging road. The trail was overgrown but walkable. I followed it for a while, the woods growing thicker and darker as I went deeper in. The air was cooler under the canopy, and I noticed strange marks on the trees. Deep scratches that didn't look like they were made by animals. The sun was dipping low when I decided to head back. On the way, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees, just a shadow, nothing clear. My heart sped up, but when I stopped and looked closely, there was no one there. Back at the cabin, I double-checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight. I made a fire inside and sat close to it, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's thin walls. I could hear twigs snapping nearby and faint footsteps crunching on the dirt just beyond the porch. I didn't sleep well that night. Every noise made me jump, and I kept imagining eyes watching me from the dark woods. On the fourth day, things escalated. I woke to the sound of the front door opening. My heart stopped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I grabbed the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood and crept to the door. But when I pulled the curtain aside, no one was there. The door was slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. I closed it firmly and checked all the locks again. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now. I decided to stay inside most of the day. Around noon, I heard a noise outside like heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then a faint knocking on the door, 3 quick taps. I didn't open it. I stayed by the window, gripping the hatchet, watching the shadows between the trees. The knocking stopped. The footsteps moved away slowly. I didn't see anyone, but the fear had taken hold. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. The wind sounded like whispers through the trees. At one point, I thought I heard voices outside, low and muffled. But when I strained to listen, it was just the rustling leaves. On the 5th day, I knew I had to leave. The cabin didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It was a trap. I packed my things quickly, grabbing the essentials and the rest of the firewood. I kept the hatchet close and checked the windows and door one last time. I heard footsteps again, slow and steady, outside the cabin. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw footprints in the soft dirt. They were too big and deep for any animal. The prints circled the cabin, coming close to the door and then disappearing into the woods. I didn't wait. I ran down the dirt road, my boots kicking up dust. The trees blurred as I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, a paved highway that cut through the mountains. I flagged down the first car that passed, a man in a pickup truck who looked at me like I'd seen a ghost. When I told him about the cabin, the footprints, the knocking, he nodded grimly and said I wasn't the first to feel uneasy there. There were stories about a man who used to live deep in those woods, someone who didn't like visitors. Nobody had seen him in years, but apparently he still roamed the forest, watching. I didn't want to believe it, but after that trip, I never went back to the cabin or the woods around it. I kept thinking about those footsteps and the way the forest seemed to close in around me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scratching on the door, the footsteps in the dirt outside, and I wonder if maybe some places are better left alone. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to take a week off work and head to a small cabin tucked away in the dense woods of northern Vermont. I was 32 at the time, working a steady but draining office job in Boston. I'd never really been one for big cities or noise, and the idea of spending a week alone in the quiet woods was something I dreamed about for years. I found the cabin listed in a small magazine about remote places. It was owned by an old couple who only rented it out during the off-season when the leaves turned and the tourists had gone home. The cabin sat near a shallow river called Hollow Creek, surrounded by thick forest and nothing but miles of quiet wilderness. There was no cell phone signal and only a dirt road that led to it, the kind of place where the air felt heavier and time seemed to slow down. I packed up my old Subaru with all the essentials: a small stove, canned food, a heavy blanket, a first aid kit, and a few books. I didn't bring much technology, no laptop, no phone charger, just a camera and a flashlight. The plan was simple: to disconnect and spend my days walking the woods, reading by the fire, and sleeping under heavy quilts in the old cabin. The drive itself took almost 4 hours from Boston. I left early in the morning to avoid traffic, and as I neared Vermont, the city noise faded into rolling hills and forests coated in reds, yellows, and browns. The road became gravel, and I slowed down, trying to catch every detail of the forest that surrounded me. When I finally saw the cabin, it was even more secluded than I expected. A small wooden structure with peeling paint and a stone chimney, sitting next to the river, half hidden behind thick pine trees. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, pine sap, and something faintly musty, like the memories of 1,000 autumns stored inside the walls. The cabin had one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a rusty stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase that led upstairs to the bedroom. The floorboards were uneven, but solid, and the windows were thick and fogged with age. I unpacked my things slowly, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. There was no phone signal, no electricity other than the small solar lamp on the porch, and no neighbors for miles. The only sounds were the river's steady murmur and the wind moving through the trees. I found an old axe by the back door, likely left by the owners, and stacked some dry wood near the fireplace. That first night, I built a fire and sat on the wooden floor with a mug of hot tea, listening to the woods outside. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the windows. The next day, I woke early to the sound of birds and the river rushing past. I ate canned peaches and dry bread for breakfast, then put on my hiking boots and walked along the creek. The forest was thick with oak and maple trees, their leaves rustling in soft gusts of wind. I walked for hours, following faint trails and sometimes slipping over mossy rocks. I took photos of the trees, the river, and small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, and once a deer drinking from the water's edge. The air smelled fresh and cold, carrying a hint of damp earth and pine needles. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew cloudy, and I hurried back to the cabin to avoid rain. The dirt road leading back was slick with mud, and my boots left deep marks in the soft ground. Inside the cabin, I lit the fire again and sat near the hearth, reading an old book I'd brought, a novel about early settlers in New England. The warmth from the fire contrasted sharply with the coolness of the cabin's wooden walls, and I felt a strange mix of comfort and loneliness. That night, I went to bed early. The wind outside picked up, shaking the cabin gently, and the river sounded louder in the darkness. I pulled the blanket tight around me and tried to sleep, but something felt off, a restless tension I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a quiet awareness that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation, that the woods were making me more sensitive. The next morning, the air was thick with fog, and the world outside looked ghostly in the gray light. I brewed coffee on the small stove and ate some canned beans while watching the river slowly appear through the mist. I decided to explore a little further today, packing a small backpack with water, snacks, my camera, and the axe just in case. The dirt road that led out of the cabin's clearing twisted through the trees, flanked by tall pines and thick underbrush. I walked carefully, noticing how the sounds of the forest changed. The usual birdsong was missing, replaced by the quiet hum of the wind and the crunch of leaves underfoot. About 2 miles from the cabin, I found an old logging path, barely visible under years of fallen leaves and small saplings. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. Curious, I followed it, pushing through branches and thorns. The path wound deeper into the woods, leading me to a clearing where an old, rusted pickup truck sat half buried in the earth. The windows were shattered, and the tires were flat. Nearby, there were faint signs of a campfire ringed with stones, cold and covered in ash. I took photos and studied the truck. It looked like it had been there for decades, abandoned and forgotten. But something about the place felt wrong. The silence was heavier here, like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to head back quickly, feeling the first twinge of unease in my stomach. Returning to the cabin, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just an old junker in the woods and nothing more. But as dusk approached, that same uneasy feeling returned. I stayed close to the fire and kept my axe nearby, chopping more wood to keep the flames strong. The wind outside grew louder, howling through the trees and making the cabin creak and groan. Then, I noticed something I hadn't before: faint footsteps on the dirt road outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal and too rhythmic. I froze, listening closely, but the sounds stopped suddenly, as if whoever made them had vanished. My heart pounded. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The cabin felt smaller, more confining. I sat with the axe resting against my legs and stared into the fire until it died down to glowing embers. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard whispering carried on the wind, but I couldn't be sure. It was just the woods, I told myself again. Just the wind and the trees. The next morning was cold and clear. The sun shone through the window, lighting up the dust in the air. I was exhausted but determined to make the best of my time. I made breakfast and planned a longer hike downstream along Hollow Creek. I wanted to find out if there were any other cabins or signs of life nearby. I packed my bag with extra water and the axe, and headed out. The forest was alive with small movements. Birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves. I stayed on the bank of the river, following its curve through the trees. After a few hours, I came to a fallen log that served as a bridge over a narrow part of the creek. The water was cold and clear, with smooth stones at the bottom. I stopped to rest, crouching by the water's edge, watching small fish dart beneath the surface. As I sat there, I noticed something strange downstream, a faint plume of smoke rising above the trees. I stood up quickly and looked harder. The smoke was thin and wispy, almost like a wisp of fog. It wasn't from the river or the trees, that much was clear. Someone else was in the woods. My mind raced. Why hadn't I heard or seen anyone before? The cabin was supposed to be remote, rented only by me this week. I debated whether to investigate or head back. The feeling of being watched returned, heavier this time. I knew the forest well enough to be cautious. I decided to follow the smoke, but from a safe distance. I stayed low and moved slowly through the underbrush, keeping the river to my right. The trees thickened, and the light dimmed under the canopy. The smoke grew stronger, and soon I saw a small clearing ahead. In the middle, someone had built a fire, fresh, still burning low. Around it were scattered supplies: a tarp, some food wrappers, and a plastic water bottle. No footprints led away from the fire, but the grass was flattened as if someone had been sitting there recently. The air smelled faintly of cigarettes and wood smoke. I felt a knot in my stomach. Someone had been here watching. Maybe they were still nearby. I didn't want to confront whoever it was, so I backed away quietly and returned the way I'd come. When I reached the cabin, I locked every door and window again and double-checked my supplies. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees. That night, I kept the fire roaring and the axe close. I stayed awake until the flames died down to embers, listening for any sound that didn't belong to the forest. I heard footsteps again, distant and slow. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. The cabin felt like a trap, isolated, defenseless. The next morning, I debated leaving. The uneasy feeling had grown into something deeper. I was 34 when I took a long weekend off and drove out to a small cabin I'd rented in the woods near Fort Bragg, California. It was September 2021. I remember because the leaves were just beginning to turn, but the air still felt warm enough in the daytime to be comfortable. I'd found the cabin through a private listing posted online. It wasn't on Airbnb or any major site. The man who owned it said it had once belonged to his grandfather and he hadn't gotten around to updating much. But he assured me it had water, power, and a working wood stove. That's all I really needed. I'd been working a remote IT job for a logistics company based out of Oregon, and I'd hit a wall with everything. My eyes hurt from staring at screens all day. My back was sore from sitting in the same chair. I felt disconnected, even though I was constantly surrounded by tech and people messaging me. So I decided to check out for a few days. No email, no calls, no deadlines. Just trees, quiet, and time to reset. The drive up from Santa Rosa took about 3 hours, cutting through winding roads lined with thick pines and redwoods. By the time I got close, I'd already lost cell service. That was fine with me. I had preloaded the map and printed out directions, just in case. When I finally turned off the last paved road, I drove 5 more miles down a bumpy dirt trail that narrowed as I went. There were no signs, just trees and shadows. The cabin sat at the bottom of a small hill, tucked between tall pines. It looked like it hadn't been painted in decades. The siding was faded and weathered gray, and the roof sagged slightly. There was a small wooden deck on the front, a single door, and 2 windows on either side. Behind it, the woods thickened fast. You could walk 10 feet past the back of the cabin and be completely hidden by trees. I got out and stretched my legs. The air smelled like dry leaves and pine needles. Everything was quiet except for birds and the occasional creak of tree limbs swaying high up. There were no neighboring cabins or houses. Nothing. I liked that. Total privacy. I grabbed my duffel bag and cooler from the back of my truck and unlocked the front door using the code the owner had sent me. Inside, it was small, just a single room with a corner kitchen, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed against the far wall. There was a fireplace on the opposite side and a narrow door that led to a bathroom with a shower and compost toilet. The windows were all sealed, and the place had a faint, earthy smell like dust and old wood, but it wasn't bad, just unused. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting my food in the mini fridge, and stacking the firewood neatly inside. I opened all the windows to get some air flowing. I walked the property a little, just checking out the area, noting the trails that looked like deer paths. There were a couple of rusted-out barrels behind the cabin and some ancient gardening tools leaned up against a stump. I didn't touch them. That evening, I cooked some simple pasta on the propane stove and ate while watching the sun go down through the trees. The light filtered through the branches in soft gold beams. The quiet was absolute. I didn't even realize how much background noise I was used to until it was gone. No traffic, no notifications, no voices through the wall. Just wind and birds and the occasional creaking pop of the old cabin settling. That night, I had trouble falling asleep, not because I was scared or anything, just because of how quiet it was. I lay in bed listening to the wind tapping against the windows, and every time the house groaned, I'd open my eyes. I guess I wasn't used to that kind of silence. At one point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard what sounded like crunching leaves out back. Just once. Then nothing. Probably a raccoon or deer. I pulled the blanket tighter and tried to focus on breathing slowly until I finally passed out. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. I brewed coffee using a little metal percolator and sat on the front deck, watching the trees. A light mist had settled in the lower parts of the woods, curling between trunks like smoke. I felt better than I had in weeks. I was thinking about maybe making this a regular thing. Renting a remote place once every few months, disconnecting, clearing my head. Around midday, I decided to hike a little deeper into the woods behind the cabin. I brought a small backpack with water and some granola bars. I didn't plan to go far. I just wanted to explore a bit. The terrain was sloped and uneven. Moss-covered rocks and the forest floor was thick with fallen needles and branches. After maybe 20 minutes of slow walking, I came across what looked like the remains of an old fence. It was mostly collapsed, just some rotting posts and rusty wire twisted between them. Past the fence, I found a clearing with a large, dead tree in the center. It had been struck by lightning or cut down long ago, and the trunk had split open like a cracked bone. It looked almost fossilized. There were a few beer cans scattered around, old ones faded and crushed. Maybe someone used to hang out here. Or camp. I kept going for another few minutes, then turned back. I made sure to follow the same trail out, using landmarks I'd noted on the way in. But near that split tree, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small pile of stones near one of the larger roots, stacked almost carefully. At first, I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but it didn't look natural. The rocks were too balanced. I didn't touch them. I just moved past and headed back toward the cabin. That night, the air felt different. The wind had died, and the forest was so still it felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath. I had made a fire in the fireplace and was reading a book I'd brought. I kept getting distracted by the feeling that something was just off. I couldn't explain it. No specific sounds or sights, just this tension I couldn't shake. Every now and then, I thought I heard a branch snap outside, But when I looked out the window, I couldn't see anything. Too dark. I went to bed around midnight, leaving the fire to burn down on its own. I locked the door and shut the windows, but I left the curtains open. I liked being able to see out. I don't know how long I lay there before I started hearing footsteps. Not animal movement, actual steps. Slow, steady. Leaves crunching softly. I froze. I didn't get up. I just lay there listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't hear them walk away. I waited. 10 minutes. Maybe 20. Nothing. I finally forced myself to get up. I didn't turn on any lights. I just stood at the window and tried to look out into the black. I couldn't see anything, but I had that feeling, the one where your body knows something's wrong before your brain does. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I checked the lock again and went back to bed, eyes wide open. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up to sunlight and birdsong. The fear I'd felt during the night seemed far away, like a dream. But when I stepped outside, there were footprints in the dirt by the deck. Not boot prints, bare feet. 2 of them, full adult size. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell walks around barefoot in the woods in the middle of the night? It hadn't rained, so they were clear and fresh, pressed deep into the soil. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed close, double-checked all the windows and locks, and kept my knife in my pocket. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, someone camping illegally nearby. But that didn't sit right. The prints circled the cabin. They'd stopped just under the window near my bed. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. The peaceful vibe I'd felt the day before was gone, replaced by something much heavier. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lights on. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something scrape across the back wall of the cabin. Long and slow. I grabbed my flashlight and sat in the chair by the door, just listening. I didn't go out there. I didn't want to. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I packed everything quickly, tossed it all in the back of the truck, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't care that I had a day left on the rental. I didn't even leave a note. I just got in and started driving. I didn't stop until I hit the highway and saw a cell tower signal pop back onto my phone. I called a friend just to hear a voice. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the owner. I didn't even leave a review. I figured whatever or whoever that was, they'd be someone else's problem eventually. I just wanted to forget it. For weeks afterward, I kept checking the locks on my apartment twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. I bought blackout curtains. I started carrying a pocket knife even around town. It wasn't some ghost story. It wasn't monsters or demons. It was something worse, real people. That's what stuck with me the most. Someone had walked barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night, circled the cabin I was sleeping in, and stood outside my window watching me. And they didn't want anything. They didn't break in. They didn't try to talk. They just watched. That was enough. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to spend a weekend alone at a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 26 at the time, working as a graphic designer in Boston, needing a break from the noise and pressure of the city. The idea of escaping to the woods, away from phones and people, was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was nothing fancy. A simple wooden structure, with a small porch overlooking a dense forest and a creek that ran nearby. No electricity, no running water, just a propane stove and a wood fireplace. Perfect for disconnecting and recharging. I arrived late on a chilly Friday afternoon, the sky dull and heavy with gray clouds. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was narrow and winding, flanked by tall pines and oaks whose leaves had already turned golden and red. I had to be careful driving my old Subaru, but the quiet alone was worth the bumpy ride. I pulled up and got out, stretching my legs as the cold air hit my face. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled my lungs. I carried my bags inside and shut the door behind me. The cabin was small but cozy. The living room had a rough stone fireplace, a couple of chairs, a rickety wooden table, and a bed against the far wall. A small kitchen area had a propane stove and a sink with a large jug of water I was supposed to carry in. There was a lantern on the table, along with some matches and a stack of firewood by the door. The windows looked out over the thick forest, where the trees swayed gently in the wind. The creek was just beyond the tree line, the sound of running water faint but calming. After setting my things down, I decided to make a fire. I stacked the wood carefully, struck a match, and soon the fireplace was crackling, the flames casting warm light around the room. Outside, the sky darkened quickly as the sun dipped below the trees. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans heated on the stove and a small loaf of bread, while watching the fire dance. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustling of leaves. I went to bed early that night, tired from the drive and the fresh air. The bed creaked beneath me as I lay down, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the branches. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire sputtering and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the woods. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The room was cold, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I reached for my lantern, lighting it carefully. The cabin felt different now, heavier, almost like the walls themselves were pressing in. I listened. There was a faint noise outside, something soft and irregular, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart beat faster. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush, but the sound didn't stop. Came closer, stopping near the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard the unmistakable scrape of something hard against wood. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to pry the cabin door open. Panic rose in my chest. I grabbed the old hunting knife I had brought, clutching it tightly. The noise stopped abruptly, and for a long moment there was silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I stared out the window but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the faint glow of the lantern. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, crunching on leaves, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to sleep, listening to every sound, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, the wind had died down and the sun shone weakly through a thin layer of clouds. I went outside cautiously. Near the door, I saw scratches on the wooden frame, deep and rough, as if made by a knife or some kind of sharp tool. The bark of a nearby tree was also scraped in the same pattern. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just an animal. Someone had been here trying to get in. I searched around the cabin and found footprints in the soft earth. They were large and heavy, maybe a man's boots. They circled the cabin once before disappearing back into the woods. I felt exposed and vulnerable, alone with whoever had been lurking nearby. I debated leaving right then, but I hadn't planned this trip to be cut short by some unknown stranger. I told myself to stay calm and watch for signs, to keep the fire going at night and make noise if anything else happened. The rest of the day I gathered firewood, filled my water jug from the creek, and tried to enjoy the quiet again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night I was extra careful. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair, kept the fire blazing, and stayed alert. The noises returned, footsteps circling outside, whispers of movement through the leaves. I didn't hear words, but I could tell someone was out there, waiting. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a loud bang on the door. The chair I had placed fell over, and the door shook under the force of someone trying to break in. I scrambled to the window and peered out, but it was too dark to see clearly. Heart racing, I grabbed my knife and prepared for the worst. Then suddenly the banging stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading quickly into the woods. The silence returned. I stayed up until dawn, sitting near the fire, eyes fixed on the door. When morning came, I packed my things as fast as I could. I left the cabin without looking back and drove away as quickly as I could on the rough road. The police took my report seriously but said it was probably some local troublemakers or drifters passing through. Nothing more. They found no trace of anyone living nearby or any history of crime in that part of the woods. I never went back. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was that night. The experience changed how I saw the wilderness. Not just a peaceful retreat, but a place where danger could hide. even if it wasn't visible or explained by ghost stories or myths. Real danger was quiet, slow, and very real. Since then, I've stayed away from remote cabins alone. Sometimes I wonder who it was that tried to get in and why. Maybe they were just desperate, maybe dangerous. I'll never know. But I do know this. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're people. And the woods don't always keep their secrets safe. I was 34 that summer when I rented the cabin in the northern part of Maine. It was about 20 miles from the nearest town, a quiet little place called Afton Ridge. I'd been working remotely for the last year and wanted somewhere I could shut out the noise, be by myself, maybe go on some hikes, and get away from how fast everything had started to feel. I wasn't running from anything dramatic, nothing like that. I just wanted space, peace, and the kind of quiet you can only really get deep in the woods. The place I found was an old one-room cabin, owned by a retired logger named Bill whom I'd found through a friend. He didn't use the cabin anymore and was happy to rent it to me for a few weeks. It was simple. One bed, a small wood stove, a sink that drained into a barrel, no plumbing, no cell service either. The only power came from a small gas generator I could run for a few hours at night if I wanted light or to charge something. There was an outhouse about 50 feet from the back door, hidden behind a few trees. It felt primitive, and that was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up there was long and bumpy. I had to take an unpaved road for the last few miles, and the final stretch was nothing more than a two-track trail. The trees leaned in close, branches brushing the sides of my car. When I finally parked in the small clearing, I just sat there for a minute with the engine off, listening. The forest didn't make the same kind of noise the city did. It had a rhythm. Sure birds, wind through the pines, the occasional creak of an old tree, but it wasn't constant. The silence had gaps in it, felt heavy in a good way. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in. The cabin had a musty smell at first, but I opened the windows and let the air move through. The floor was bare wood, old but solid. A few mouse droppings in the corners, but nothing serious. There were cobwebs in the rafters, but I left them alone. The bed was stiff, but the mattress was clean, and I'd brought my own sheets anyway. I stacked firewood inside near the stove and made a list of things I'd need to pick up the next time I drove to town. Extra water, more propane, maybe a few canned goods. That first night was colder than I expected. I got the stove going, but the heat didn't reach far. I had to wear a hoodie and wrap myself in my sleeping bag. I lay awake for a while, listening. When the fire went out, the sound of the forest filled the cabin again. Sometimes a branch would crack or a small animal would scurry past, and I'd freeze trying to figure out what it was. But it always passed. Eventually, I drifted off. Over the next few days, I settled into a rhythm. Mornings were cool and misty. I'd walk a little, make breakfast, and then sit outside with my coffee, just listening to the forest wake up. In the afternoons, I'd read or work on my laptop with the generator running, then cook a simple dinner, usually beans, rice, or pasta, and go to bed early. I saw a deer once, just at the edge of the clearing. It froze when it saw me, then turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. That kind of thing made the whole trip feel worth it. The trouble didn't start right away. Crept in, small and easy to ignore. The first time I noticed something off was about a week in. I'd gone for a short hike along the old logging trail that started behind the cabin. I didn't go far, maybe 2 miles out and back. When I returned, the door to the cabin was cracked open. Just slightly. I was sure I'd closed it. I even remembered pulling it shut and turning the latch. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it. The forest was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. I walked up slowly, listening, looking for signs of animals or maybe someone passing through. But nothing was disturbed. Inside, everything was as I left it. My gear, my food, even my phone charging on the little table next to the bed. I figured maybe I hadn't latched it all the way, and the wind had pushed it open. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, that night I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt closer. I kept imagining someone standing out there in the trees, just beyond the firelight. The next strange thing happened 3 days later. I'd gone into town to restock, spent a couple hours walking around Afton Ridge. It was the kind of place with one main street, a diner, and not much else. I liked that about it. When I got back, I found my water jug had been moved. I always kept it beside the wood stove, and I was sure I left it there that morning. Now it was by the front door, just sitting there like it had been placed there on purpose. I stood in the doorway for a while, staring at it. I checked everything. My backpack, my clothes, even the food shelves. Nothing else had been touched. I was starting to get this crawling feeling in my stomach, like I was missing something obvious. But there was no sign of forced entry. No footprints, no broken windows. I kept telling myself it had to be me. Maybe I'd moved it before leaving and forgot. Maybe I was getting too paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The turning point came 2 nights later. I was asleep when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew that right away. It was footsteps. Not heavy, not rushing, slow, careful steps on the gravel outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and I stayed perfectly still. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was dark except for a bit of moonlight through the window. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped just outside the front door. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was there. Then, just barely, I heard a creak, the sound of weight shifting on the porch. My heart was thudding so loud I thought whoever it was could probably hear it. I didn't move. After a while, the sound went away. No footsteps leaving. Just gone. The next morning, I found prints in the dirt.
Bootprints.
Not mine. They were larger and fresher than any of the old logging ones out on the trail. Whoever had been there had stood outside my cabin for a while, just watching. I felt something deep in my chest shift. Something I hadn't felt in years, real fear. Not movie fear, not roller coaster fear. The kind that makes your body go still and cold, like it's trying to disappear. I packed my gear and left that afternoon. I didn't say anything to Bill or the people in town. I just told myself I'd go home for a few days and come back when I felt better. But something about it wouldn't let go. Even in my apartment back in Boston, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the locks, waking up in the middle of the night thinking I'd heard footsteps again. It didn't make sense. I didn't know what I was afraid of, not really. There had been no break-in, no confrontation, no crime. Just that slow, steady build-up of something being wrong. A week passed. Then 2. I thought about the cabin every day. I tried convincing myself to forget it, but I couldn't. Something had happened out there and I didn't understand it. That bothered me more than anything. So I went back. This time I didn't unpack. I brought a camera and set it up on a motion sensor outside the cabin. I placed trail markers leading out in different directions and checked them every few hours. I started keeping notes, logging every sound, every small change. I barely slept, drank too much coffee, and jumped at every noise. 2 nights in, I caught something on the camera. A man, mid-40s maybe, tall, beard, wearing an old jacket. He stood about 15 feet from the front porch for almost 10 minutes, staring at the cabin. He never moved, just stood there. The video ended before he left. I took the memory card into town the next morning and showed it to the sheriff. He watched it without saying much, just leaned back in his chair and stared at me afterward. He said it was probably a drifter or some hunter passing through. Told me if it happened again to come back and report it. That was it. Nothing more. I didn't go back after that. I told Bill he could keep the rest of the rental money. I didn't care. I packed everything into my car and drove all the way to my brother's place in New Hampshire that same day. I stayed with him for a week, then found another apartment closer to the city. I haven't been back to Maine since. Every now and then I still watch that video. Just once, never more than that. And every time, I remember the feeling I had that night, when I knew someone was just outside, standing in the dark, listening to me breathe. That feeling hasn't gone away. But at least now I understand it. It wasn't about ghosts or legends or anything made up. It was the simple, cold truth that sometimes people do things that don't make sense. They watch, they wait, and you don't always find out why. I stayed in a remote cabin in northern Vermont in the fall of 2019. after I'd taken a break from my job in Hartford. I was 34 at the time, feeling burnt out from long weeks of sales travel, and I'd started to get this urge to just disappear for a while. A friend of mine, Darren, who used to do Forest Service work, told me about an old cabin near Peacham Lake that was still standing from when the state used it back in the 70s. It wasn't an official rental or anything. It was just there, empty on public land, no one guarding it, and it still had a working wood stove and bunk. He'd been there once while hiking and said it was perfect if I just wanted to be left alone. I had no reason not to trust him. So I packed up my stuff, some canned food, rice, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, a radio, and other basics, and drove about 4 hours up north. I left my car parked off an old dirt road, took a trail marker into the woods, and after about a 2-hour hike with a heavy backpack, I found the place. It looked like a forgotten ranger cabin, small, square, with a slanted roof and walls made from thick gray logs. The door creaked when I pushed it open, but the structure itself was solid. There was a narrow bunk nailed to one wall, a pot-bellied stove, and a little table with one chair. There was no insulation, no electricity, and the only light I had at night came from my headlamp and a few cheap lanterns. But it was quiet and clean enough, and it felt safe. The first 2 days were good. The weather was cool and cloudy. I spent time walking trails, reading old paperbacks I'd brought, boiling coffee on the stove, and writing thoughts down in a small notebook. I kept to myself, not because I was scared, but because that was the whole point of being there. No phone, no internet, just me and the trees and the sound of chipmunks running across leaves. On the third night, the wind picked up. Leaves hit the windows hard, and the trees outside groaned with each gust. I woke up around 1 a.m. to a scraping noise that I thought was just a branch brushing against the roof. Kept happening irregularly, like it was being dragged back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but it kept me up. In the morning, I went outside and checked the roof. Nothing up there. No branches long enough to reach that high. I shrugged it off. Maybe it had been something small up there, raccoon, maybe. Later that afternoon, I hiked to the edge of the lake. There wasn't a soul around. No boats. No cabins on the water. I stayed there for a while and returned to the cabin around 5, just as the sun began to sink behind the trees. When I got back, I noticed something strange. My sleeping bag was unzipped. I was sure I had left it zipped, rolled tight in a bundle. It wasn't laid out like someone had slept in it, just open. I told myself I probably just misremembered. Maybe I'd left it that way after airing it out. That night, around 11, I heard movement outside, crunching leaves. Not a deer, slower, steady, like a person walking. I sat up on the bunk and turned off my headlamp. The sound stopped. I waited in silence, listening. It was dead quiet for a few minutes. Then I heard something knock against the wall near the stove. Just one knock. Not a tap. More like a hard thud, like someone hit it with a fist or a rock. I grabbed my hatchet and stood near the door, barely breathing. I didn't go outside. I stood there for a long time, then eventually locked the door, if you can even call it that, a small bolt latch near the handle. After that, I laid back down with the hatchet resting across my chest and didn't sleep until it was nearly dawn. The next day was cold. I stayed close to the cabin, collected more firewood, tried not to think about the sound from the night before. I kept scanning the trees whenever I stepped outside. The forest had started to feel less peaceful and more like it was watching me. I didn't like that. Still, I didn't pack up. I told myself it was probably just a porcupine or a raccoon, maybe even a bear checking out the cabin. But there were no scratch marks, no broken wood, no tracks in the dirt, just quiet. On the 5th day, I noticed something missing. A small camping knife I kept on the table. It wasn't there. I looked through my bag, through the little drawer near the bunk, even outside where I chopped wood, but it was gone. It wasn't an expensive knife, but I knew I hadn't lost it. I always kept it in the same place. That made my stomach turn. The idea of someone walking in while I was out, going through my stuff, it didn't feel like an animal anymore. It felt personal. That night, I locked the door again and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't have a gun, just the hatchet and the folding saw. I kept both beside the bunk and slept in my clothes. I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement again. Soft footsteps, leaves shifting outside. Then silence. Then a faint creak, like pressure on the porch boards. I held my breath. I swear I could hear breathing outside the door. Then, nothing. It stayed quiet for the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked everything. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. But the can of beans I'd left near the stove was gone. I hadn't eaten it. I hadn't moved it. I checked everywhere, thinking maybe I misplaced it. I hadn't. That was the moment when I knew, without a doubt, someone had been coming in while I was out or asleep. I started carrying the hatchet with me even during the day. I felt watched. I kept looking over my shoulder when I hiked to the lake or into the woods. That day, I found something else that didn't belong. A piece of twine tied around a branch at eye level, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. It looked fresh, bright blue, not weathered like the rest of the forest. I hadn't put it there. It didn't mark a trail. It didn't lead anywhere. That night, I built a fire outside and stayed up late beside it, hoping the light would keep whatever or whoever was nearby away. Around midnight, the fire burned low, and I was just about to head inside when I heard a sound deeper in the woods. A high-pitched whistle. One note, then silence. Then again. Same tone. It didn't sound like an owl. It didn't sound natural. I didn't respond. I grabbed my bag, my light, and the hatchet, and I went inside, bolting the door. I didn't sleep. The whistling never came closer, but it happened twice more before sunrise. By then, I'd had enough. I packed up as quickly as I could, skipped breakfast, and started hiking out around 7 a.m. I didn't look back at the cabin. I stayed alert, checking behind me every couple of minutes. I thought I was alone, but about halfway back to my car, I found something on the trail. My missing camping knife. It was stabbed into the middle of the path, stuck in the dirt upright, just standing there like someone had placed it for me to find. I stood frozen for a minute, staring at it. I didn't touch it. I walked around it and kept moving, faster now, heart pounding, listening for any noise in the woods around me. When I reached the dirt road, my car was where I left it. I unlocked it, threw my pack in, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I hit Montpelier. I pulled into a gas station, sat in the car with the engine off and tried to calm down. My hands were shaking. I never called the police. I didn't have any proof. Nothing was stolen beyond food. I hadn't seen a face, hadn't been attacked. I just knew I was being watched, and someone had been inside that cabin with me, or when I wasn't there. I told Darren what happened weeks later. He didn't say much, just that he'd never go back there. I still think about it sometimes. I don't go camping alone anymore. I haven't been back to Vermont. That trip was supposed to give me peace, a break from people. Instead, it reminded me that the scariest thing out in the woods isn't some wild animal or ghost story. The someone watching from the trees. Someone who doesn't want to be seen. Someone who doesn't say a word, just waits, and lets you know in the smallest ways that you're not as alone as you think. It was October 2021 when I decided I needed a break from the city. I was 32, living in a small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and working from home for a finance company. The job wasn't bad, but the daily noise, traffic, and isolation had worn me down. I had gone 2 full years without a proper vacation, and I could feel it in my bones. So when my manager approved a week off, I booked a remote cabin in northern Michigan. I didn't want beaches, cities, or amusement parks. I wanted quiet, just a forest, a lake nearby, and some time to clear my head. The place I found was about an hour outside of Marquette, tucked away near a narrow gravel road that barely showed up on Google Maps. The listing was simple: a small log cabin with solar power, a fireplace, and a hand pump well. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 7 days and packed up my SUV with a cooler full of food, a pile of paperbacks, and my old fishing gear. I figured I'd read, fish, and sleep, no distractions, no obligations. The drive up was peaceful. I took it slow, stopping for gas and snacks along the way. The farther north I went, the more the scenery changed. The trees were taller, the air was cooler, and everything smelled like pine. I turned off the main highway just past a small town called Bergen and drove down a long stretch of unmarked road. The gravel kicked up behind me in thick plumes, and the only sounds were the tires crunching and the wind through the trees. I reached the cabin just after 4 p.m. The place was smaller than I imagined, just one story with a sloped green roof and a tiny porch out front. It looked solid though, built from real logs, not one of those prefab ones. The yard was overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers, and a rusted metal fire pit sat off to one side. Behind the cabin, the forest thickened quickly, and I could just make out a faint trail leading deeper into the trees. A faded wooden sign nailed to a post read North Trail, but there weren't any markers after that. The key had been left in a lockbox under the porch, and everything inside was as expected, Spartan but clean. A small bed, a table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a bookshelf with a few worn-out novels. The fridge ran off solar and was humming softly. I unloaded my stuff, put the perishables away, and lit a fire in the stove. The cabin creaked in the wind like any old structure does, but it felt sturdy enough. I settled in quickly, cooking some sausage and eggs for dinner and drinking a few beers I'd packed. As the sun set, the trees outside turned black, and the only light came from the fireplace and my flashlight. It was quiet in a way that made your ears ring. No traffic, no people, no anything. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The bed was old but surprisingly comfortable, and the blanket was heavy and warm. I kept a lantern nearby but didn't need it. The darkness was complete, but not frightening. In the distance, I heard a few animal sounds. Something scurrying across the roof, maybe a raccoon, but nothing unusual. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. and made coffee on the stove. I sat out on the porch and watched the forest slowly come to life. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and I felt this deep calm settle over me. Around noon, I grabbed my fishing pole and hiked down to a small lake about a mile away. The trail was narrow and uneven, but it was clear enough to follow. I spent the afternoon fishing from the shore, catching and releasing a few small perch. It wasn't about the fish, it was about the stillness. I didn't see another person all day. When I got back to the cabin, I was tired but relaxed. I made pasta for dinner, read a few chapters of an old novel, and went to bed early. The third day, I decided to explore the trail behind the cabin. I packed a small backpack with water, jerky, and my compass. The trail started clearly enough, but within 20 minutes, it narrowed and the trees thickened. I followed it carefully, checking my direction every so often. The forest was denser than I expected, and the further I went, the quieter it got. I didn't hear birds anymore. Even the wind seemed to die down. Felt like walking into a bubble. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd. A piece of blue tarp caught high in a tree. It was tangled in the branches about 10 feet up, and it looked like it had been there a while. Torn and faded. Beneath it, there was a flattened area of grass and a few rusted cans scattered around. Like someone had camped there maybe months or even years ago. I checked around a bit more but didn't find anything else. No bags, no fire pit, nothing. Just that strange tarp and the feeling that someone had been there long ago. I turned back. It was still early, but something about that spot made me uneasy. I made it back to the cabin just after 2 p.m. and spent the rest of the day inside, chopping wood and reorganizing the supplies I'd brought. I wasn't scared, but there was this new weight in the air, something I couldn't name. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about that campsite, how it didn't seem abandoned so much as left behind quickly. On the 4th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died out, and the room was freezing. I got up to throw more wood in the stove, but then I heard it, a crunch outside, like a footstep on gravel. I stood completely still. The cabin has no neighbors, no nearby roads, and I hadn't seen a soul in days. I slowly stepped to the window and looked out. The yard was pitch black. I turned off my flashlight so I wouldn't make myself visible. I waited. Nothing. Just the creak of trees in the breeze. After 10 minutes, I gave up, convinced it had just been a branch falling or an animal. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night, I barely slept. I kept thinking of that tarp in the tree, of how quiet the forest had been. The next morning, I checked the yard carefully. There were no footprints, but the grass was disturbed near the fire pit, flattened in a wide circular patch. I told myself it was probably a deer, but it looked wider than that. I didn't fish that day. I didn't hike. I stayed inside, reading and trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. That evening, I made dinner early and locked up tight. I barred the door, closed the shutters, and kept the fireplace low. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the lights completely and just sat in the dark. I don't know why, I just felt like I needed to listen. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same crunching sound. Slow and heavy. Not an animal. Something moving in a circle around the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for it to pass. It stopped near the window for a long time. Then nothing. I waited another hour before moving. When I finally went to the window, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found something new. On the side of the cabin, someone had carved a mark into the wood. 3 straight lines about 6 inches long, perfectly even. I hadn't noticed them before, and they weren't there when I arrived. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed everything in less than an hour. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, just loaded up the SUV and left. As I backed out of the yard, I checked the side mirror. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, but when I looked again, the space was empty. I drove straight back to Columbus that day, stopping only for gas. I never told anyone the full story. I didn't want people thinking I'd imagined it or that I was paranoid. But I know what I heard. I know those marks weren't there before. And I know something or someone was out there with me. A few weeks later, I looked up the area near Bergen, Michigan. I found an old newspaper article about a missing person from 2014. A guy in his 40s who went out to stay in a hunting cabin and never came back. They found his truck, but not him. The article had a photo of the trail marker, North Trail, same as the one behind my cabin. I haven't been camping since. I still think about going back sometimes just to see. But the truth is, I don't think I was supposed to be there. I think someone else still is. I was 31 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin in northern Minnesota. It was September 2022. I had just come out of a long, draining breakup and needed space. I didn't want to stay at home where everything reminded me of her. I had no interest in talking to friends or pretending to be okay. I wanted isolation, quiet, and just something that felt like control. I booked a cabin I found online, one of those small private ones near Lake Iskatika, about an hour past the last real town if you took Route 47 and then a dirt road for 6 miles. It looked peaceful in the pictures. One room, wood-paneled walls, a wood-burning stove, a small deck, and nothing but woods around it. The kind of place where you'd hear the wind and maybe some loons on the lake in the distance. No one else around. That's what I wanted. The drive took about 5 hours from my apartment in St. Paul. It was long and uneventful, mostly flat land and stretches of tall pine. I stopped at a grocery store in a small town called Bertram and picked up enough food for the week: frozen meals, canned goods, a few snacks, bottled water, and instant coffee. I also got a spare gas can, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I'd grown up around the outdoors and wasn't completely clueless, but I wasn't exactly a survival expert either. Still, I liked to think I could handle myself for a week alone in a cabin. When I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The dirt road had gotten narrower and rougher the closer I got. There were no signs or driveways, just my phone GPS, which had stopped updating about 15 minutes before I got to the cabin. I recognized it from the photos. It was smaller than I expected, with a mossy green roof and some rot around the bottom edges of the exterior siding, but it looked solid enough. There was a padlock on the door like the listing had said, and the key was exactly where it was supposed to be, in a metal box nailed behind the wooden post by the stairs. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood. The cabin was one open room with a small kitchenette in the corner, a twin bed by the window, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow wood stove. There was a short hall that led to the bathroom, just a toilet and a sink with cold running water. The air was cool and damp, and everything felt like it hadn't been used in a long time. I unpacked my bag, lit a couple of candles from the shelf, and sat on the steps out front eating a sandwich while the trees turned black against the sky. No cars, no voices, no movement except for a few birds rustling in the branches. Felt good. The first day was uneventful. I woke up early, made coffee on a little portable burner I brought, and spent the morning walking the woods behind the cabin. I didn't follow any trails. There weren't any marked, but the trees weren't so dense that it was hard to move around. I kept my bearings by tracking the sun and occasionally looking back to remember the way. The woods were thick with pine and birch, and the ground was soft with needles and moss. I saw deer tracks, squirrels, and even heard what I thought was a fox barking once. It was peaceful, quiet enough that you could hear leaves settle when the wind stopped. I spent the afternoon reading an old paperback I'd brought and took a short nap before dinner. I didn't bother locking the cabin. I had the only key, and it was so remote I figured there was no need. That night, I lit a fire in the stove mostly for comfort. It wasn't cold enough to need it, but I liked the glow. I sat on the floor watching the flames and fell asleep early. The next morning, I noticed something strange. When I went outside, I saw boot prints in the dirt near the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were larger and deeper than the hiking boots I wore. These looked more like work boots. I looked around, thinking maybe a hunter had wandered by, but it was private property, and the tracks weren't just passing by, they circled the cabin. Not a perfect circle, but they stopped near the back window and again by the sidewall under the bathroom window. That unsettled me. I hadn't heard anything during the night, and I slept pretty lightly. I checked the door and windows. Nothing was broken or moved. Still, it made me uneasy. I brushed it off. Maybe the owner had come by to check on the place. Maybe someone was lost. I tried to think of normal explanations. I spent that day fishing at the edge of the lake, which was about a 10-minute walk down a small slope behind the trees. I didn't catch anything. I barely cared. The water was still and dark, and I sat on a rock for hours just listening to it lap against the shore. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Every little crack in the woods made me turn my head. I had this low, constant feeling that someone was nearby. Couldn't shake it. That night, I locked the cabin door. I hadn't planned to, but I did it without even thinking. I kept the flashlight close and didn't light a fire in the stove. I lay awake for a long time listening. At some point, I drifted off. Around maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything, but I had the feeling again. That tight pressure in the chest, like someone was standing just outside the door. I sat up slowly and stayed still for a while. No footsteps, no breathing, just the normal creaks of the old cabin and the breeze outside. Eventually I fell asleep again, but it wasn't restful. The next day, things escalated. I went outside and found a small piece of metal on the step. It was a rusted nail, not bent or broken, just sitting there like it had been placed. I looked up and down the railing. Nothing seemed loose. I walked around the cabin again. This time I saw more boot prints, fresher, closer to the windows than before. I noticed a small scratch on the back window pane. Just one thin line, not wide or deep, but it hadn't been there before. That's when I started to get paranoid. I took a kitchen knife and put it next to the bed. I also brought in a heavy branch I'd found in the woods and leaned it near the door. I felt ridiculous, but I also knew something wasn't right. I decided not to stay outside long that day. I kept the door locked and tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. Every little creak in the wood or gust of wind made me jump. I ate cold canned beans and crackers for dinner because I didn't want to make noise heating anything. That night, I pushed the small dresser in front of the door. It was flimsy, but it gave me some sense of control. I kept my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other as I lay on the bed in the dark. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound of gravel being stepped on. Not loud, not close, just a faint crunch, like someone slowly moving through the dirt outside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. The noise stopped after a few seconds. Then nothing. I waited and waited, but I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I was too scared of what I'd see. I stayed like that until morning. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could and loaded it into the car. I did one last walk around the cabin. When I got to the backside, my stomach dropped. There were scratches on the siding. Not deep gouges, just narrow, straight marks, about 6 inches long, lined up in a row near the window, like someone had run a tool or a knife along the wall. I didn't take pictures. I didn't want to remember it. The drive out was tense. I kept looking in the mirror. Every bump in the dirt road made me jump. When I finally got to pavement, I pulled over and sat in the car for 10 minutes, just breathing. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, but what would I say? That someone walked around a cabin and maybe scratched a window? There was no crime, no proof. I didn't want to deal with it. I just drove home. I never found out who it was. Maybe it was some drifter. Maybe a hunter who didn't like people in his area. Maybe someone who knew the cabin was remote and liked to scare people. I changed my number a month later when I got a call from an unknown number with no message. Could have been anyone. Probably nothing. But I didn't want to risk it. Since then, I haven't gone back to the woods alone. I still think about it sometimes when it's quiet at night and I can't sleep. I remember the sound of those steps outside and the way the air felt, like someone was watching. I remind myself it ended okay. I got out. Nothing happened. But it's not something I'll ever forget. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see. It's knowing someone was out there, close, quiet, and patient, and you'll never know why. I was 36 the year I decided to rent out a remote cabin in northern Minnesota. It was late October, 2019, right before the snow started to settle in for good. The place was called Crescent Rock, just a tiny dot near the edge of Lake Marnell, way up near the border with Canada. I'd found the listing on an old travel forum. Some guy had posted a thread years ago about how peaceful it was, and after digging around online, I found a property management website that still listed it for rent. It was cheap too. Too cheap, really. That should have made me pause, but I was looking for somewhere quiet. I'd burned out pretty bad working in the city. My job was remote by then, and I figured if I brought my laptop and hotspot, I could still handle a few things while getting a break from the noise. I drove up alone in my beat-up SUV, loaded with a week's worth of groceries, a few boxes of supplies, and some old winter gear I hadn't used in years. The road started paved but turned to gravel about 20 miles from the cabin. It wasn't much, just 2 tire tracks running through thick, leafless woods. The drive-in took another 45 minutes, winding past patches of birch and pine. It was the kind of place where cell service dropped fast, and you couldn't see more than 20 feet into the trees. I passed 2 old signs on the way in, both rusted to hell, one of them half knocked over. There were no other cabins in sight, no signs of life at all. When I finally pulled up to the place, it was late afternoon. The cabin looked smaller than the pictures made it seem. 1 story, faded wood siding, a metal chimney, and a wraparound porch that leaned a little to one side. A narrow path led down to the lake, but I couldn't see much of the water from the front. There was a small shed out back, padlocked, and a pile of firewood stacked against the far wall. No lights, no noise, no neighbors. Just woods and the sound of wind slipping through branches. Inside, the place was dusty but not dirty. 1 main room with a couch, a stone fireplace, and a table by the window. The kitchen was a narrow strip off to the side, with a working fridge, an old gas stove, and some mismatched cabinets. There were pots and pans hanging above the counter, and a bunch of canned food left behind on one shelf. I took a mental note of that. It felt odd, but maybe the last guest left them. The bedroom had a queen mattress on a metal frame and a closet with some old jackets hanging inside. No TV. No radio. Just a landline on the wall, probably dead. That first night, I unpacked, made some pasta, and sat by the fireplace with a book I never ended up reading. The fire crackled. The wind picked up a little. And I remember thinking how good it felt to be away from the city. Just silence and space. I slept hard that night. No noise, no lights, just a cold room and the sound of the wind tapping against the cabin walls. The next morning, I woke up early. I went out to the lake with a thermos of coffee and stood by the water. It was completely still. Not a single ripple. A light mist rolled along the surface, and I could see the tree line on the other side stretching out in every direction. There wasn't a dock, just a patch of worn grass and rocks. I stayed there a while, breathing in the cold air, sipping coffee, not really thinking about anything. That afternoon, I walked the woods behind the cabin. There were no trails, just thick undergrowth and scattered branches. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile, before I turned back. The trees were tight together, and the light didn't cut through very well. Everything felt a little off in there. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just trees and the soft crunch of old leaves underfoot. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that hadn't caught my eye before. A fresh footprint in the dirt near the shed, bigger than mine, pointed toward the forest. Could have been mine, I told myself. Maybe from earlier. But I couldn't remember walking that close to the shed. I brushed it off, went inside, and cooked dinner. That night, I kept the fire going longer and listened to the wind. Felt louder. At some point, I heard a sharp knock outside, like something hard had struck the side of the cabin. I froze, waited. Then it happened again. Just once. I got up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. Nothing. The woods were pitch black. I stayed near the fire for another hour, poking at the logs, before finally heading to bed with the fire still burning low. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing the bathroom. The air in the bedroom felt colder than it had the night before. The floorboards creaked loud under my feet as I crossed the room. When I got to the bathroom, I noticed something else. The front door latch was undone, just hanging there. I stared at it for a long time. I knew I'd locked it. I always did. I shut it tight and slid the deadbolt, then stood there listening. The woods outside were silent, completely still. No wind, no animals, no sound. The next morning, I checked the door again. Still locked, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I skipped my usual walk and instead stayed near the cabin, cleaning up the kitchen and sorting through the firewood. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was just me. At one point, I went out back and took another look at the footprint by the shed. It was still there. No new prints. But now the padlock on the shed looked different. Scratched, like someone had taken a tool to it. The metal was worn in one spot, like it had been twisted or bent. I didn't open it. Something about that felt like a bad idea. Instead, I went back inside, took a long shower, and turned on my laptop to try and get some work done. No internet. The hotspot wouldn't connect. I rebooted it twice, then gave up. The landline still didn't work either. I hadn't thought to bring a signal booster. I guess I figured it would be fine. That night, I didn't light the fire. I wanted to hear better. I sat on the couch, lights off, just listening. At around 10, I heard something. Not wind, not an animal. A slow shuffle on the porch, then the sound of weight shifting on old wood. Someone was standing out there. I sat frozen, staring at the front door. The footsteps moved, soft and heavy, around to the side. I couldn't see anything from the windows. Then it was quiet. I stayed up until dawn, sitting with my back against the wall, holding the fireplace poker like an idiot. Nothing else happened. Just silence. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care how early it was. I didn't care how much I'd paid. I loaded everything into the SUV as fast as I could. When I went to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead. No sound. No click. I tried the lights. Nothing. It had been working fine all week. I opened the hood and stared at the engine like I had any idea what to look for. The battery cables were still connected. No corrosion. But there was a smell, like burned rubber or plastic. Something wasn't right. I went back inside and locked the door. Sat there trying to think. I was 2 hours from any town. No cell signal. No working phone. The only road out was the way I came in, and I didn't feel safe walking it. I didn't know if someone was out there watching. I didn't know how far I'd get. The woods weren't empty. That much I was sure of. That night I barely slept. I pushed the couch in front of the door, moved the kitchen table to block the back entrance, and kept a knife on me. I sat in the corner of the bedroom with my back against the wall, staring at the window. Just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, measured, right outside. Then something brushed the window. Not a knock, not a tap, just a soft drag, like fingertips sliding across the glass. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there after that. Probably hours. When the sun came up, I forced myself to move. I went out again to the SUV. Still dead. I opened the back and started pulling gear, warm clothes, flashlight, water, whatever I could carry. I left a note inside the cabin, just in case. Scribbled where I was heading and when I left. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but it felt right. I started walking down the road around 9 a.m. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. Every few minutes I stopped to listen. No birds. No wind. Just my own footsteps. I kept thinking I'd hear something behind me. Once I did. A soft crack. I turned fast, but saw nothing. I picked up the pace. Took me nearly 5 hours to reach the nearest house. An old farm with a wide clearing and 2 trucks out front. The woman who answered the door looked at me like I'd crawled out of a ditch. She didn't ask questions. Just called someone to pick me up. I reported what happened. Gave them the address. They sent a deputy out there later that week. He called me after. Told me the place was empty. No signs of forced entry. The SUV had a cut battery cable. The shed had been broken into, but nothing was taken. Just some old tools inside. They didn't find anyone. No tracks, no evidence. Just a few scratches on the windows and 1 clear handprint on the glass. Bigger than mine. I was 38 when I decided to take a break from everything. That year, 2021, had been a mess. Between long hours at the construction site, my shoulder injury, and the whole thing falling apart with my ex, I was running on fumes. I needed to disappear for a while. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that didn't smell like concrete dust and sweat. So I rented a cabin through a small site I found online. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. Just a plain HTML page that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2004. But the photos looked decent enough. A small wooden cabin in northern Vermont, about 20 minutes from a town called Belford. No neighbors, no service, no Wi-Fi. It was exactly what I needed. I took my old black Ford Ranger and drove up from central Connecticut, the bed stuffed with supplies. Mostly dry food, water, tools, and a couple jugs of gas. I brought my .22 rifle too, not because I planned to hunt, but because I always kept it close whenever I stayed somewhere remote. There were bears in Vermont and plenty of other things that could go wrong. I got there just past noon on a Tuesday in late September. The dirt road that led to the cabin was narrow and winding, with trees thick on both sides. I kept the windows rolled down for fresh air, and the smell of pine mixed with that earthy smell you only get in the woods. After about a mile of bouncing over rocks and potholes, I saw the clearing open up ahead. The cabin was exactly like the photos. Small, 1-story, cedar siding darkened by age, green moss creeping up from the base. There was a little porch with a broken rocking chair and some stacked firewood next to the door. No one else was around. Not even a bird chirping. Just dead quiet except for the wind in the trees. I parked the truck beside the porch and stepped out. I stood there a while, just breathing it in, letting the quiet settle into my chest. Felt good. Heavy but good. Inside, the cabin was rustic but functional. The kitchen was tiny, just a sink, a propane stove, and a mini fridge that only worked if the generator was running. There was a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. The bedroom had a cot-style bed, a metal frame lamp, and a dresser that smelled like mothballs when I opened the drawers. Everything creaked, the floor, the doors, even the air felt like it creaked. I spent the first day unpacking, making the place livable. I filled a couple 5-gallon buckets with water from the nearby stream, just to have some backup. The generator sat in a shed behind the cabin, and after a few pulls on the cord, it coughed to life. I didn't want to waste gas, so I planned to use it sparingly, just for cooking and the fridge when needed. I had 2 coolers packed with ice for most of my food anyway. That night, I sat on the porch with a beer, wrapped in a flannel blanket, and just watched the trees sway. The stars were clear, no city light in sight. I slept better than I had in months. The second day was mostly uneventful. I hiked around the woods a little, just exploring. There were no marked trails, but I stuck to compass bearings and made sure I could always trace my way back. I came across an old hunting stand in a clearing about half a mile out. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. Birds had nested inside it. I made note of it and kept moving. That afternoon, I chopped some firewood, organized my supplies, and wrote in a journal I brought along. That night, I sat by the fire I built outside and listened to the forest. A few branches cracked now and then, but that's just the woods. Trees settling, animals moving through brush. Normal stuff, but things started to feel off on the third night. I'd gone to bed around 10, curled up in my sleeping bag with the windows slightly cracked. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of what I thought was footsteps. Slow, careful ones. I stayed still, eyes wide open in the dark. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it, deer maybe or some other animal. But I couldn't shake how heavy the steps sounded. Like boots, not hooves. They didn't last long. Maybe 10 seconds. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for a while before I got up and quietly grabbed the rifle from the corner. I stood there in the dark, listening. Eventually, I sat down on the edge of the bed, rifle across my lap, and waited. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. Didn't see anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything moving through. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe I just heard a branch fall or an animal that sounded heavier than it was. I spent the rest of the day distracted. I tried fishing in the stream but didn't catch anything. The air felt colder. I double-checked that the cabin doors and windows locked. That night, I brought the rifle into bed again, just in case. On the 5th morning, I found something strange. Right at the edge of the clearing, near where the tree line started, there was a fresh cigarette butt, still a little damp. I hadn't smoked in years. I don't let people smoke in my truck. There was no trash around it, no footprints, no crushed grass. Just that single cigarette like it had been dropped there carefully. I picked it up with a paper towel, brought it inside, and set it on a napkin near the sink. My hands shook a little, but I tried not to let it get to me. The generator had burned more gas than I expected, so I decided to cut back even more. That night, I didn't turn it on at all. I made a cold dinner, crackers, jerky, a little cheese, and sat in the dark with just a lantern and the rifle across the table from me. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps again, this time on the porch. Slow, measured, maybe 4 or 5 steps. Couldn't breathe. I turned off the lantern and just listened. No knocking, no voice, just those few steps and then silence. I sat there until the sun came up. In the morning, I found nothing. No prints, no scuff marks on the wood. The rocking chair hadn't moved, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I just knew. I packed most of my gear into the truck that day, left only a few essentials in the cabin. I planned to leave early the next morning, even though I still had a few days left on the rental. I wasn't going to stay another night, but I did, because that afternoon my truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I checked everything I could. Connections, fuses, corrosion, but nothing worked. I tried jump-starting it using the generator, but it wasn't strong enough. I didn't have cell service, and the nearest road was miles away through thick woods. I was stuck, at least for another day. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the window, lights off, rifle in my lap. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement near the tree line. Just a flash, a shape, too quick to make out, but it was there. I watched the tree line for over an hour. Nothing moved again. But when the sun came up, I found another cigarette butt. This one was closer to the cabin. No ash, no burn marks on the grass. Like it had been placed there, not dropped. That morning, I packed everything I could carry into my backpack, including the rifle, and started walking. I left a note inside the cabin with the date and time, just in case. I marked the direction back to the main road using ribbons from my first aid kit. It took over 6 hours to reach the highway, and when I did, I flagged down a trucker who let me ride in the bed back to Belford. From there, I got help. A few days later, I went back with a tow truck and a sheriff's deputy. My truck was exactly where I left it, cabin untouched, but the sheriff found footprints in the dirt behind the shed. Deep ones, like someone had stood there watching the back of the cabin for a long time. There were cigarette butts scattered around that area too. At least 10 of them. No one could say how long they'd been there. They never found who it was. The rental owner said only one person had access to the property, and it wasn't him. I never got answers, but I haven't gone back into the woods alone since. I still have that cigarette butt, the first one I found. I keep it in a plastic bag in a drawer. A reminder, not of fear, but of caution. Because it wasn't the forest that made me leave that cabin. It was the feeling that someone else had chosen not to. It was late September 2013 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone in the mountains of northern Vermont. I had just turned 34 a few months earlier, and work had been eating me alive ever since the company merger in spring. I was behind on sleep, stuck in a loop of phone calls, meetings, emails, and then more emails. I wanted to disconnect for a while, and the idea of doing nothing for 3 or 4 days somewhere quiet seemed like the only way I'd survive the rest of the year. I didn't want to fly anywhere. I just needed quiet, trees, fresh air, and a place where my phone wouldn't buzz every 10 minutes. I found a rental cabin on a private piece of land near a lake about 20 miles from Montpelier. It looked old but solid. No Wi-Fi, no cable, just a fireplace and a view of the trees. That was all I wanted. I got there around noon on a Thursday. The drive from Albany had taken longer than I expected, mostly because I stopped for groceries and filled up my tank in town before heading up the final 12 miles of unpaved road. The trees had started to change color, but the air was still warm, especially for that far north. The directions said to drive until I passed a rusted metal gate on the left, then take the narrow dirt path for about a quarter mile. I followed the instructions, and eventually the road opened up to a small clearing with a single-story wooden cabin sitting in the middle of it. It looked exactly like the photos. Weathered dark brown siding, green shutters, a small porch with a bench, and a woodpile stacked neatly along one wall. It felt remote, peaceful, and untouched. I parked beside the cabin, unlocked the front door using the code the owner had sent me, and stepped inside. The air smelled like old wood and dust, not bad, just aged. There was a small kitchen to the left with a gas stove and an old white refrigerator that buzzed faintly. The cabinets were stocked with some basics: salt, pepper, tea bags, sugar, and a few cans of beans and soup. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the kitchen window. To the right, the living room had a stone fireplace, 2 armchairs, a lamp, and a tall bookshelf filled with paperbacks. In the back of the cabin, there was a single bedroom with a queen-size bed, a small dresser, and a nightstand. The sheets looked clean, though a bit faded. The bathroom was across the hall, tiny but functional, with a toilet, a sink, and a shower that ran hot after a few seconds of chugging and groaning. After unloading my bags, I changed into a pair of hiking pants and a sweatshirt, then made myself a sandwich. I sat outside on the porch and ate while listening to the birds. There was no traffic noise, no planes overhead, not even wind. Just the occasional call of a woodpecker or a squirrel rustling through leaves. I felt the tension in my back start to melt away. This was exactly what I needed. I spent the first afternoon walking around the edge of the lake, taking photos of the water and the trees, watching the sun drift across the sky. I saw deer tracks near the muddy banks and even found a trail that curved up a hill behind the cabin. I told myself I'd explore that the next morning. By evening, I had chopped a few logs with the hatchet out back and lit a fire inside. I made pasta, opened a beer, and read an old mystery novel I found on the shelf. I didn't check my phone once. I slept like a rock that night. It got colder than I expected, and I had to pull an extra blanket out of the closet, but I liked it. The next day, Friday, I got up early, made coffee, and set out to follow the trail I'd found. I packed a granola bar and a bottle of water and hiked for a couple of hours. The path went uphill for a while, then curved through a grove of pine trees. I didn't see anyone, not even a cabin or a shack, just forest. Eventually, I reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. I sat down on a fallen log, breathed in the clean air, and thought about nothing for a long time. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was nearly 2 p.m. I heated up a can of soup, ate on the porch again, and spent the rest of the day reading and chopping more wood. I didn't think anything was off until that evening, when I went to grab my phone from my backpack to check the time. The battery had died. I thought I'd left it in airplane mode, but maybe I forgot. I didn't have any chargers that worked without an outlet, so I just left it in the bag and figured I'd check it on Sunday before driving home. I didn't care about missing calls. Nobody knew exactly where I was, but I had told my sister I'd be away and gave her the address just in case. It didn't seem like something to worry about. Saturday morning felt colder than the last two. I woke up with the feeling that something had changed, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I figured maybe it was just the temperature, or the fact that the sky looked overcast through the kitchen window. I made a quick breakfast, grabbed my jacket, and went outside to stretch. As I stepped off the porch, I noticed something strange near the tree line about 50 feet away. A small pile of broken branches had been arranged in a sort of circular pattern. It didn't look natural. The sticks were all the same size, snapped clean in the middle, and placed neatly in a shape that reminded me of a compass or a wheel. I stared at it for a few seconds. My first thought was that maybe some local kids had been up here messing around, but the land was private. The nearest house was supposed to be 5 miles away. Then I thought maybe an animal did it, though I couldn't think of any that would snap branches and lay them in a perfect circle. I walked over, crouched down, and studied the pattern. It didn't feel threatening, just strange. I kicked a few of the sticks aside, then stood and looked around. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything either, just the trees creaking in the wind. I brushed it off and went back inside. The rest of the day was quiet. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting someone to be standing in the trees watching me. But I never saw anything. That night, after dinner, I tossed more logs in the fire and read for a while. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the lamp and went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I couldn't explain why. There hadn't been a sound, at least none I remembered, but my body was on edge. The room was completely dark. I lay there for a few minutes, listening. First, it was just silence. Then I heard something. A soft, slow sound, like footsteps on dirt. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. It had a rhythm to it, like someone was walking slowly around the cabin, circling it. I didn't move. I didn't even sit up. I just stared at the ceiling and listened. The steps came closer, then paused. Then a few more steps. Then silence. My heart was hammering. I reached slowly for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand and clicked it on. But I didn't get up. I waited. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, after maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I heard a sharp knock. Not on the door, on the far wall of the cabin. Just once. Then nothing. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I didn't sleep a second after that knock. I didn't go outside either. I sat in the living room with the fireplace lit, staring out the front window, waiting for something. Anything. Around 7 a.m., I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The air was freezing. I stepped out and walked slowly around the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but on the far wall, near the rear window, there was a mark. A fresh scuff in the wood, maybe from a boot. Right below the window. That was enough for me. I went inside, packed my bags in a hurry, and locked the cabin behind me. I tossed everything in the car, turned the engine over, and backed down the dirt road as fast as I could without hitting anything. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved highway, phone finally charging, bars showing up again. I called my sister just to hear someone's voice, even though I didn't explain what happened. I got home that afternoon and didn't sleep for 2 days. I kept checking the locks. I kept the curtains closed. I emailed the owner of the cabin the next week. I didn't say much, just that I'd left early and that something felt off on the property. I never got a reply. When I went back to the listing to leave a review, it had been removed. I tried Googling the address. Nothing came up, not even a rental page. It was like it had never existed. I still think about that sound at night. Those footsteps. That knock. The pattern in the woods. I'll never know who or what was out there. But I know it was real. And I know it was close. Too close. I haven't gone back into the woods alone since. And I never will. I was 33 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin in northern Idaho, near Priest Lake. It was early October 2017, the part of the year when the air turns dry and the nights feel sharper. I had just gone through a breakup and wanted time away from my job, my phone, and the noise of everything. I worked in Spokane as a mechanic, and the days were always loud. Clanking tools, hydraulic lifts whining, customers explaining noises their cars made using weird sound effects. I liked the work, but I needed quiet. I'd heard about a place from a coworker. His cousin owned a small off-grid cabin, deep enough into the woods that you couldn't hear any road traffic. It didn't even have cell service. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The guy agreed to let me use it free for a week, as long as I promised to clean up and not touch any of the equipment stored in the shed out back. I packed enough food for the week, filled 2 5-gallon jugs with water, loaded my truck with a sleeping bag, lanterns, and a few books. No laptop, no music. I didn't want any kind of distraction. I just wanted to sit in the middle of nowhere and clear my head. The drive took around 3.5 hours. The last 20 miles were on a dirt road that narrowed into a winding path. Trees leaned over it like they were closing in from both sides. Pine needles crunched under my tires, and chipmunks darted across the road every few minutes. It was cloudy the day I arrived, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, the temperature had dropped into the low 50s. The cabin was small and basic. Wood exterior, 1 door, 2 small windows in the front. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. No power lines, no mailbox, no driveway, just a patch of dirt and a rusty fire ring in front. The shed sat about 20 feet behind the cabin, older looking and locked with a heavy steel latch. I unloaded everything, carried it inside, and started getting the place set up. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood and something musty, like a mix of old books and wet leaves. The floor creaked, and the walls were lined with wooden planks. There was a cot with a foam mattress, a small table, 2 folding chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. A pile of chopped firewood was stacked beside it, and there were several extra blankets folded near the cot. A battery-powered lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling. That night, I made a fire in the stove, heated up a can of chili, and sat by the flames with a book in my lap. I remember the warmth of the fire and how quiet everything was. The kind of quiet you don't get in cities. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional crackle from the stove. The first couple of days were peaceful. I went on long walks in the woods, always bringing a small GPS and a whistle just in case. I didn't see anyone else. No footprints, no wrappers, nothing to suggest people had been nearby recently. Just animal tracks in the dirt, deer mostly. I sat outside in the afternoons, watching the light change through the trees. I wrote a little in a notebook, made fires at night, read until I couldn't keep my eyes open, then fell asleep to the sound of the woods. But on the 4th day, things started to feel off. It was late afternoon, maybe around 4 p.m., and I'd just come back from a long hike. I sat on the steps of the cabin, drinking water, staring into the trees. That's when I noticed something, just a flicker of movement. I saw a shape between the trees about 50 yards out. At first, I thought it was a deer. I kept staring, waiting for it to move again. Didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. After a few minutes, I went inside and closed the door. I told myself it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. That night, I heard something strange. It was about 2 a.m. I was half asleep when I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching in the leaves outside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the woods. Then they stopped. The silence after was heavier than usual. I sat up and reached for the axe I kept near the bed. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just sat there listening. After a few minutes, I heard the same sound again. Faint steps, this time moving away from the cabin. It was too heavy to be an animal. It sounded like a person. But who the hell would be out here at 2 in the morning? The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't find anything unusual. No tracks, no damage, nothing disturbed. I tried to put it out of my mind. I spent the day chopping some wood and walking around the property. But I kept looking over my shoulder. That feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. On the 5th night, I locked the cabin door with a chain I'd brought and stacked some logs against it from the inside. I kept the axe beside my sleeping bag. I was nervous but figured maybe it was just my imagination. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of wood clinking. A faint sound, like something brushing against the logs I'd stacked at the door. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Then, minutes later, another sound. Faint, like fabric brushing against wood. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, holding the axe across my chest. I waited for more sounds, but eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I found 2 things that made my stomach twist. First, one of the firewood logs I'd stacked in front of the door had fallen sideways, like someone had pushed it. Second, behind the cabin, I found a piece of orange fabric caught on a branch at about shoulder height. It looked like nylon. I didn't remember seeing it there before, and I hadn't walked back there since the first day. I circled the cabin for an hour, trying to find tracks or signs of someone. I didn't find much, just more broken branches and a small area near the edge of the clearing where the pine needles looked disturbed, like someone had stood there for a while. That day, I didn't go on any hikes. I stayed close, kept the fire going, and kept checking the woods every few minutes. I'd planned to stay the full week, but I decided I'd leave the next morning, a day early. I didn't feel safe anymore. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I stayed up with the lantern on low, listening. Just after 1 a.m., I heard a soft scraping sound on the outside wall, near the back of the cabin. It wasn't wind or branches. It was something deliberate. I got up slowly, moved to the side window, and tried to look out without being seen. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the sound kept happening, slow and steady. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps moving around the side of the cabin. They stopped by the front door. Then there was silence. I held the axe tighter and sat against the wall, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The next sound was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A quiet click, like someone testing the door handle. I stayed absolutely still, trying not to breathe loud. After that, nothing. Total silence. I waited until dawn before I moved. When the sun came up, I opened the door and checked outside. No tracks, no signs of anyone. But I was done. I packed everything in under 10 minutes, threw it in the truck, and drove out of there without looking back. When I got back to Spokane, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said the cabin was too quiet, and I cut the trip short. But about a week later, I got a call from the guy who'd let me use the place. He asked if I'd left anything behind. I said no. Then he told me someone had broken into the shed behind the cabin. The padlock was missing, and some tools were gone. He thought maybe it had been animals, but the tracks around the shed looked like boot prints. He asked me if I'd noticed anything. I just said no. I never went back there, and I never asked for more details. But I still think about it. I think about the sounds I heard outside the walls. The firewood moved from the inside. The piece of orange fabric. I think someone was watching me, maybe even following me. Whoever it was didn't break in. Maybe they were just waiting. Maybe they liked seeing how close they could get without being caught. And maybe they weren't there for the tools in the shed. After that, I never stayed in an off-grid place again. I still go camping, but never alone, and never without a way to call for help. That trip changed the way I feel about the woods. I still love the quiet, but now I know that sometimes you're not as alone as you think.